and today I've been asked to help facilitate this program with Aisha, who I will introduce in a minute. But firstly, it's a bit of housekeeping. The toilets are just past the steps on your right. There's male, female, and another as well. Teas, coffees at the back if you guys want to drink. Help yourselves at any time. In case of an emergency, the muster point is just the car park at the back, or what I call the back over there. And please put your phones on mute and just turn the volumes down. If mine rings, I will apologise right now. It doesn't do as it's told. It's happened to me a couple of times yesterday at workshops, so it keeps on ringing. So it still hasn't learned who's the boss, but I'll teach it as we go along. Or I'll learn him, as my old people tell me. Now, I would like to introduce Aisha Moss from Environs Kimberley. Aisha has worked and lived in the Kimberley for 10 years, the last 5 years as an ecologist and project officer at Environs Kimberley within their Kimberley Nature Project team. The Kimberley Nature Project collaborates with Aboriginal and community groups across the region to protect, manage and document ecologically and culturally important species and ecosystems. That's a mouthful. I should have coffee. Aisha's recent project work has been within the Kimberley Community Seed Bank, collecting seed with ranges for revegetation, nursery work and product development, as well as supporting the development of a Kimberley Aboriginal-led bush resources industry. Would you like to come up, Aisha? Thanks.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks everyone for coming along. I thought I'd start by giving a bit of background as to why we're here, how we got to this space. Okay, I thought if people don't know much about Environs Kimberley, I thought I'd give a quick overview and talk about why we're here in this space and supporting an Indigenous-led bush products industry. So our vision is for the natural environment of the Kimberley to be protected and well managed. Environmental and social sustainability are guiding principles for development. Our goals, and I think 3 of the 4 goals relate to what we're looking at today, and those are that Kimberley lands and waters are protected and sustainably managed. There is a conservation economy within the Kimberley, and that we have strong collaborations at regional, national and international levels. So that's how we fit in as an organisation. I'm going to give up on the slideshow. So a few years ago there was a roadshow that came to Broome, and they were looking at bush products. So they came and it was a wonderful 2-day workshop, and then that was it. So there were a few issues and questions and discussions started at that workshop, and there was nowhere for them to go. So we called a meeting with 10 to 15 people, and we started talking about what would be the next steps, what would be a good vision forward as a combined group. And one of the things that came up that people felt united over was looking at some kind of certification that allowed a product or a business to become a trusted brand that spoke to customers and said, this is an authentic Aboriginal product. We know that People were collecting the plants and the seeds and the leaves and the flowers in a sustainable way, in a culturally appropriate way, and that you could know that also that end product, that the money that you were paying for that end product, that a good price was getting back to those people. So similar to fair trade and some of those other certifications you may have heard about. So that was a few years ago, and the way that the stars have aligned, we've now had a partnership with Impact Seed and the University of New South Wales, who unfortunately can't be here today, obviously, because of COVID and restrictions, but we do look forward to having them come up when the borders open to give a presentation and talk about intellectual property and access and benefit sharing, possibly sometime next year. But trying to make it to work, sure. I'm just trying to, I guess one of the problems is we're trying to zoom and run a slideshow at the same time. I think, don't worry about it. Okay, thank you. All right, okay, so yes, this is what I mentioned. It was called Growing the Growers, the workshop they had in 2017, and then and there's it's kind of a small blurry photo, but a photo of the follow-up workshop we had with local Kimberley Aboriginal producers, and we had a few meetings from that to get to this point of coming up with a possible name for the group and a brand, which was the Kimberley Aboriginal Bush Plant Resources Group. And some of the aims, some of the things that were uniting people and they were passionate about were to protect Aboriginal knowledge and ownership of bush plant resources, advocating and lobbying to establish an Aboriginal bush plant industry in the Kimberley, for this group to act as a lead agency and representative body for the Kimberley region, and to be, if an accreditation and a certification is something that happens, that they would be the body that administers that. Yes. I think. And then, yes. So that's the background, and so here we are with an opportunity now we've got Daniel Mackie from Impact Seed, who is going to talk about the ins and outs of certification and what that might look like for the Kimberley. But to start with, I've also invited a few other support organisations to come and give a quick 5 to 10 minute presentation about how they fit into the picture and how they can provide support to people in the industry. So to start with, I've got Dr. Margaret Raven and Professor Daniel Robinson from the University of New South Wales, and they're phoning in via Zoom. So if you bear with me for a moment, I'll get them up on the screen. Perhaps while I'm fiddling, Maria, would you mind doing the bios for? Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, before we start, really importantly, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge my countrymen that are in this room. Thanks for being here. Next speaker will be Daniel Mackay from Impact Seed. Sorry. Right, yeah, we have got Dr. Margaret Raven. Sorry, the slide isn't good for my old eyes, but please bear with me. I did do my homework, but Dr. Margaret Raven is a University of New South Wales.
Can you please unmute yourself? I am, but I've missed all of the start because you're on mute, so I don't know where we're at.
Hi, can you hear us?
I can, yeah.
Thanks.
So I'm sorry, can you just tell me whether I'm talking now or not, because I've missed the whole front section. I don't know where we are in the program.
Margaret, I'm just going to introduce you. Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you want me to talk now?
I will introduce you, then you can speak.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Dr. Margaret Raven is a University of New South Wales Science Fellow. She is also Chief Investigator with Daniel Robinson on the 5-year Australian Research Council Discovery Project called Indigenous Knowledge Futures, Protecting and Promoting Indigenous Knowledge. Margaret is a geographer with research interests related to protocols, biodiversity, conservation, and Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous forms and practices, food, security justice, and Indigenous and human rights. She has 20 years' experience working on Indigenous knowledge related to biological resources and biodiversity conservation, Indigenous research, rights, healthcare and ageing, and food policy and food security. Okay, over to you, Margaret. Thank you.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from Sydney or Gadigal country. I live, for those that know Sydney, not very far from Redfern Station. I am originally from Western Australia, so for those who might see the look, I'm Yamaji and Noongar, so I grew up in Kalgoorlie and Geraldton, and I've done a bit of work in Geraldton and have been up to Broome quite a bit. So my mum, I've got the same name as my mother, so some of you might know of my mum's name, and my last name is actually my dad's name, Raven, but I'm an Edwards and a Wally, if you want to situate me somewhere. So from the introduction, I just want to explain a little bit more about who I am. So I'm at University of New South Wales in Sydney, and I'm a Scientia Fellow, so I work full-time as a researcher, and I've been working with Dan for probably over 5 years now on traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge and biodiversity conservation. And I'm particularly interested in working with Aboriginal people and those people who worked in the sector around making sure that Aboriginal people get back the benefits from the knowledge that they share in whatever context that is. And the way that I've worked on that is to look more at what the kind of cultural protocols might be, or what the rules might be around who can share knowledge and under what circumstances they can share it. Now those protocols might be written or they may not be written. Some organisations will write one, so the Desert Knowledge Cooperative Research Centre had one written down, and I looked at that as a part of my PhD. But there's a lot of kind of unwritten rules in the community, but most people know what they are if you ask someone who has a right to use this knowledge or use this particular information. There's a general sense of what they are, so they don't necessarily have to be written down. But that's the bulk of the work that I've been doing. And as a side note, I have had a case study in Geraldton working on food security, not specifically related to Indigenous knowledge, but just really concerned that a lot of our mob don't have enough to eat because they're on unemployment benefits or some other kind of support. So that's another part, and there is kind of a segue between Indigenous knowledge and bush foods and plants, particularly around like kangaroo and fish and bungera. Anyway, so I think Dan's going to mention the project a bit more in Vanuatu and the Cook Islands in relation to our work and also some other work that he also does. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks. Just before I start, maybe if you can mute at Environs Kimberley, because I can hear a pretty bad echo just for a few minutes. Thanks. Thank you. So I'm on Dharawal country in southern Sydney, and just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and elders past and present and emerging. So my name's Daniel Robinson. I'm a professor at the University of New South Wales with Margaret, and I'm in the Environment and Society group. My background's geography as well. And I'm on this 5-year project with Margaret. It's called Indigenous Knowledge Futures, Protecting and Promoting Indigenous Knowledge. And we are sort of doing a few different things that, as the name suggests, try to protect and promote Indigenous knowledge. I've sort of come at this from sort of about 15 years of work relating to the issue of biopiracy and misappropriation. Some of you might have heard of biopiracy and misappropriation. So this is, I started this work in Southeast Asia, in Thailand particularly, and then the Pacific, and for the last sort of 5 or 6, 7 years I've been doing more in Australia. And it's where there's companies that are, and researchers that are coming and looking at Indigenous knowledge, and traditional uses of plants, of bush foods and medicines. Sometimes it's animals too. And then going away and doing research on those and filing for patents and forms of intellectual property rights. And that can be really offensive to Indigenous people, but it can also be problematic for them in terms of business and enterprise as well. So it can be the patent. If people file for intellectual property like patents, they can restrict bush food activities. So we've been trying to analyse this. I've been looking at this for 15 years, and we've been, through our project, we also sort of do a bit of searching of patent documents to see what companies and what researchers might be looking at and trying to file for protection of inventions, so-called inventions, relating to bush foods and medicines, basically, to things like gubbinge or kakadu plum is one particular plant species where there's been a lot of interest from industry, from foods, cosmetic creams, those sorts of things. And there have been a number of companies that have tried to file patents on relating to uses of kakadu plum or gubbinge. And so, that's obviously concerning for many groups that are involved in that industry, that growing bush foods industry, but also because that, gubbinge might be on your country and it might be culturally significant species. So, obviously we're concerned about that, and we're trying to find ways to protect and promote Indigenous knowledge. We also do a few other things. So once we've done some of that analysis, we can advise communities and enterprises. So we've talked to some of the people in the NACPA group about gubbinge or kakadu plum. We also look at the National Biodiversity Framework and comment on the biodiversity laws in Australia relating to what's called access and benefit sharing under the Nagoya Protocol. So the Nagoya Protocol is a relatively new law relating to the Convention on Biodiversity. And that sets up a framework for access and benefit sharing, where people who want to access that bush food or medicine have to get permission through prior informed consent and set up a benefit sharing agreement in negotiation with the providers. And that might be traditional owners, it might be a land council, it might be an Aboriginal organisation. So that's what we want. We want a negotiation, prior informed consent, negotiation, benefit sharing. If researchers are serious about accessing a biological resource that might have traditional knowledge associated with it. And the last thing, as Margaret mentioned, is that we look at, we do community protocol development as well. So we've been doing this project, this 5-year project in Australia, but also in the Pacific Islands. So in Vanuatu and Cook Islands particularly, we've been doing the same sorts of work. And I'm part of an international network, an international project that is looking at access and benefit sharing. And part of that is trying to recognise communities' customs, customary law, beliefs and values relating to the bush foods and medicines, and if we document that in a simple community protocol, then when companies or researchers or even ecotourists come to that community, they can see the specific rules about what you can and can't do relating to plants. So I don't want to keep going on, so I just wanted to tell you about the project, but we can obviously, we would like to be there in Broome. Unfortunately, we can't because of the COVID situation. But if this is of interest to any of you, please feel free to get in touch with us through Asia. And we did come to the Kimberley, up to Broome and visited a few people last year, but we'd be keen to do this and support your enterprises if we can in relation to some of these issues. So do please get in touch, and we're willing to reach out and help and provide further advice about the legal aspects or benefit sharing, or we can search things in terms of concerns about patents and intellectual property, or if a community protocol for a particular area or bush food or medicine is of interest, we could also help with that. So that might do for me. I don't want to keep going on and on, but I hope you have a great day today, and thanks for having us just briefly to talk about our project. Thank you.
Thanks.
Do you want to add anything, Margaret?
No, just what you said. I'd really like to come back and provide some support where needed. So if there's anything that we can do to support the work that's currently happening in the Kimberley, then please get in contact with us, probably through Aisha. It's probably the best.
I guess it's worth saying the project should go for another 2 to 3 years. Because of COVID, we think it will get extended. Most of these projects will get extended. Any questions?
As mentioned, I work for Parks and Wildlife Service, so I'll cover the whole West Kimberley district. So pretty much here past Fitzroy Crossing and land and sea. So we've got a fairly big patch for one person doing compliance for the district. I'm here to discuss our licensing system that we currently have at the moment for Parks and Wildlife relating to flora. Mostly in relation to garbage collection in the Kimberley. It's not working. Alright. Yeah, so in the past we have had issues, especially around the Broome town site. That relates to damage of trees, so people actually cutting trees down, removing branches, also stripping all of the fruit from the trees, and sort of commercial level harvesting within the Broome town site. So at the moment we can't sustain that. It's unsustainably, it can't be done any like that in the future. And we're working to educate the local people how to do it sustainably, and so we've got enough fruit for people in the community, but also manage a sustainable yield each year for the commercial harvesters. So that's an example of a tree in town. It's a gubbins tree which has been chopped down, or all the higher branches felled so that people can gather fruit. This is very culturally offensive to the Yari people in town here. That means that no one will be able to get fruit for the year. So that's what we're trying to avoid, and we just need to get the message out how to do it correctly. So So currently, this is our legislation that we have. So the CALM Act, so the Conservation Land Management Act, relates to our estate. So that's joint management estate, but also areas vested under the Conservation Commission. So that's national parks, reserves, and other protected areas. And we also have the Biodiversity Conservation Act, which manages flora and fauna, and that's tenure blind, so that's across the whole state of WA. Yeah, so I forgot to mention that under the Biodiversity Conservation Act, that controls the licences, which are applicable to flora harvesting in Western Australia. It's a bit small for you to read. There's customary purposes definition, so that allows Aboriginal people to harvest fruit for their own personal use. So that is not commercial level, it's just people going out and getting some berries for themselves. And we want to encourage that, and it's your right to do that, and it's listed under our legislation that you are allowed to do that. So it just says for artistic, ceremonial and other cultural activities, preparing or using medicine, and preparing or consuming food for customary purposes. And this is only applicable to Aboriginal persons under the definition. Next slide, please. That defence does not allow commercial harvesting. So if there is commercial harvesting, you require one of our licences, which stipulates what you can and can't do, and where you can harvest, and how you go about it. Next slide, please. These are our licences. So, flora taking commercial purposes licence, which is the one that everybody will require in order to pick for commercial purposes. And there's also a flora dealing licence, which allows people to on-sell that the gummidge that's being collected, or other species as well. This is a map of the Broome area and our estate. So all the areas with the overlay are no-go areas. So that's calm land, and so that's protected areas where we don't want people harvesting from, unless they're Aboriginal people and it's for personal use, not commercial gain. So if you can see the map, it includes all of Minya Park around town, where we've previously had issues, for the Berrigan area up north, and also Crab Creek and that area as well. So those areas are a no-go, except for personal use, or for non-commercial gain. You also in any area of land you require traditional owner approval, and we're currently working on developing a map that shows which groups of or native title claims are over which area of land, so that people can get the correct approvals to go and harvest when they need to, for commercial purposes, that is. Next slide. So our future actions, we're currently working with NBY and Environs Kimberley to develop some new updated licence conditions, which I'll go into in a minute, and also create a map, which I just mentioned, just with the traditional owners. And we're also going to step up our patrol presence this year around our conservation estate, to prevent sort of ongoing damage to trees this year. It'll probably be mostly educational for the start, but we will be ramping it up if we get future non-compliance. Again, this is probably too small for you to read, but that's our proposed new conditions that we're putting in. So it just mentions how you can go about harvesting, what amounts you can take. So we're saying you can only take 20% of the fruit from each tree. for commercial harvesting. And also not targeting trees which have been damaged by fire. So we'll be looking at the fire regimes which could put the tree under stress and then create future issues for the survival of the plant. And also have the written approvals from the traditional owner groups, which we spoke about before. Next slide, please. So if anybody wants to apply for the commercial purposes license, this is our website. I've got some copies of the application form here as well if you wish to get one. And all of the inquiries, please direct them to wildlife licensing, which covers flora licensing as well. So that's their email, which you can get them on. Any questions at all? Yeah. Sorry, I missed.
To help hold those laws up, to educate people and ask that the buyers of the fruit ask the pickers to comply with flora licensing.
Hi, my name's Robin. I'm working with the Yereman Women's Organisation. So they've moved in recent years from collecting as customary practice to recently getting their first licence, their commercial licence. As I understand it, that's just for one person per licence, and I'm just wondering if you could just perhaps clarify that for everyone here, and in what do you find that there's been a practice of one person getting a licence and then hiring other people to help collect for them? You could just talk about that.
That has been an ongoing issue. We are working on that at the moment. We would like
Hi, Kevin May from DPIRD, formerly the Oak Department and all that kind of stuff. In 2009, we provided funding alongside or in partnership with the Small Business Centre here in Broome to do a video around the gubbins. And it was in relation to the licensing. It was in relation to, where you can pick, where you can't pick. And it was also in relation to the not only just the picking but the storage and the transportation of the garbage. Kimberley TAFE was also involved in it, or in partnership with us as well. They have a little block just at 12 Mile. Before you actually get to 12 Mile, it's Department of Water land, but Kim Courtney is doing some enrichment planting there. But if I can just say, write down garbage the right way and Google it, and you'll come up with that video. Bear in mind though that you need to still have the conversations with people as far as the licensing is concerned. But that is a DVD that is available to the public to have a look at. So write down the garbage the right way, and it'll pop up and it'll cover quite a bit of stuff. But bear in mind, regulations are there and they change from time to time.
Thanks, Kevin. Also might add that all the licensing for exporting garbage interstate is covered by a DPERD, so you speak with the Department of Ag from that agency if you need anything to do with that.
Can I ask, what is the Customary license?
I'll have a look. Hold on. Yeah, so the 1 year application fee is $120. 3 years is $230, and that was the renewal fee. The new licensed application is $145. 1 year, 3 years, $255.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Hi, I'm Pat Torres. I run the business called My Harvest, and I'm one of the major players in the garbage industry. Just have some questions. 1993 was when native title was declared in Australia. And even though the Native Title Act is not very kind to us, it's still an instrument for us to use. Now, 1993, so how many years ago was that? And my question relates to, if it's already been proven that we, the Indigenous people, were the first peoples here, and if you take that argument too, that it was our peoples who developed the plant over the last thousands of years, and gubbing, amongst other bush foods, are not just a cultural item for us, it's an economic item. But I notice that, when government creates policies and laws, it's always about putting us in a cultural space, which denies us our ability to argue the economic and the business side of this whole industry. So when the new laws were created, because all of a sudden we got this new fees, new laws for licensing, I'm not aware of any consultation that ever happened with Indigenous people. And so it was a bit of a shock to see how far, it was $25 a year, and then all of a sudden it jumped to $125, and there were all these other conditions put into place. So what I'm trying to say here is that where is the involvement and engagement of Indigenous people in an item that our people actually developed? So if our Indigenous people were not on the land, you wouldn't have those plants today, because it was our farming regime, plus our land and sea management, conservation skills, knowledge and practices that created the environment that we all enjoy of in Australia today. So I'm reaching out to you as a member of that organisation to ensure, apart from Nyamba Buriyaru, more engagement. Because when I do my introduction, this is actually Jugan people's land, not Yaru. And Yaru hold the native title, but this is not Yaru people's land. Yaru people's land starts way past Crab Creek. So when you're negotiating with NYB, you're actually denying us, the Jugan, a chance to actually be involved on lands that belong to us. So, and that's just part of that difficulties that come out of native title. Native title gives ownership to a group, but there's been a lot of terrible political things that have happened, and so one particular group, land managers, it was my families that created the product thousands of years ago. So, and it's people coming from other places who are destroying those areas you're talking about. So, yes, TAFE has been involved in producer licensing training. Definitely the Ag Department created videos, and they were fantastic. But last year was a terrible, terrible mess. You had people coming from eastern Kimberleys and other people all around the area who just totally annihilated trees. That's going to take 20 to 50 years to regrow. So I'm saying be aware of the political situations that exist in this country and involve a bit more people than maybe who you are currently involving. And the rangers play an incredible role managing the land and country. But there's a need for people to decolonise their minds about how you're working with Indigenous people, because we are not just cultural beings, we're also economic beings, and we need to be involved in any kind of decision making and development of our own industry. So when I do my session, I'm going to be talking about Indigenous-led bush food industry groups and give people access to joining and being involved in the discussion. So I'm not here to blame people, I'm here to talk about proper collaboration and proper engagement by Indigenous people. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria. It's really good to have your views as well. Everybody's views and comments are very important and respectful. And yeah, thanks. Any more questions? Bit of homework for you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, after Peter, Chris Young from Many Rivers. Chris is based here, but he can probably tell you a little bit about himself. But Chris is based here in Rome with Many Rivers. And you have a colleague that works here as well, Chris?
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, hi. How's that? Okay, I think we've got it under control now. So cool. Okay, so thanks so much for the opportunity to come in today and introduce myself and what we do in the community. So my name's Chris. I work for an organisation called Many Rivers. Is anybody in the room that has heard of Many Rivers before or had anything to do with us? Okay, one. I'm actually going to dispense with the slides and everything as well today, guys, and just hopefully just have a conversation with you all just quickly about what we do. I've been living in Broome for over 20 years. My family's originally from Tasmania, so we moved across with Dad for the whole mining boom there in the 90s, and we eventually found our way up here. So Many Rivers is a not-for-profit business support service. We operate all over the country, and we're really interested in getting people to start, stay and thrive in business, basically. Okay, so the services that we offer can start right from the very start with people, right when they've just got an idea, just a concept. Okay, and we come in and we start to help them flesh out a business plan and a cash flow around that idea, set some goals for the future, and really start to try and explore what the barriers might be that might be stopping them from getting to where they want to go. What sort of sets us out as maybe a little bit different is that we try and form long, enduring relationships with our clients. So we're definitely there, and we're there quite full on at the startup phase. So when somebody's just trying to formulate an idea and get it off the ground, obviously there's a lot to think about and do and consider. But then we like to check in, quarterly, even 6 monthly later on when the business is completely established, to see what those goals might be going into the future there. The other thing is, I think one of Aisha's colleagues, Malcolm, mentioned when I went to go and meet with her that we do the microfinance or the finance lending, and we absolutely do that. It's a bit of a misconception that that's all we do, and that in order to come and get service from us that you need to be getting a loan. That's not the case at all. I have many clients that work with me that don't have a loan at all. It's just a tool there that if it's indicated in what the client needs to get their opportunity up and off the ground, we can look at it, we can explore it if it makes sense for them. We'll go ahead and do that. If we don't need to do it, we'll leave it. Similarly, another excellent advantage that we've got is we can facilitate pro bono legal support for our clients. So if they need some kind of legal advice around customer agreements, credit terms, employee agreements, all of this type of stuff, even partnership agreements between a couple of individuals about what the nature of their relationship will be, we can get them connected up with Squires, Patent Bogs, and they do a full legal consult with them and come back with all of those documents that they need there. So that's pretty much it about what we do. Our focus at the moment, 100%, is in record keeping and getting people interested in that with their enterprises right from the very start, rather than an afterthought that sort of happens once the tax office or other entities starts asking them for records. I've actually bought one of our record keeping kits here. I'll put towards the back of the room. You guys can have a look through here and see what's in there. We certainly don't suggest that a lot of people will stay here. They'll move on to more sophisticated bookkeeping and record keeping systems like Xero or Wave or some version of Mile, but this just helps us work with people when they are starting right from the very start to keep everything organised there, so it's all in one spot. So if they're coming to work with me or their accountant or bookkeeper, they've got all of their records all in the one place there. That's pretty much it. Yeah. Did anybody have any questions about who I am or the work we do?
License to collect seeds, because it's part of the Argyle Diamond Mine rehab project and all the countrymen's up there are collecting seeds, but we've also had to get licenses. I have a copy of my license which came through, which it's really good that I'll put it on the table over here so people can have a look at it. It's only to collect seeds for native plants associated with the whole mine area, because when the mine closes, of course, they've got to go back and grow seeds, grow plants again. And all of that collaboration was done with the Murrong and Gidgum up that side, so about what plants we need to put back into the ground. So my license cost me roughly about $150. So my daughter has one as well. So it states where we can go and what we can collect and stuff like that. But I'll put a copy of the license here so people can have a look at it later on in the break. Okay, Daniel. Daniel is the Director of Sustainability and Certification at Impact Seed. He's the leader in the sustainability and social impact sector with over 10 years experience, specialising in sustainability accreditation, certification and measurement practices in food and fibre supply chains nationally and internationally. His focus has been on building and facilitating collaborations between businesses, producers and not-for-profits to deliver better outcomes for businesses, people and the environment. Thank you.
That's embarrassing. But I can't say I'm not used to that. That's fine. Just check that works. Excellent. All right. Yeah. So, g'day everyone. My name's Daniel. I've come up to talk specifically about certification, but from a very personal experience point of view, hopefully, in that, and I'll talk through it as we go through. But when I heard that there was a previous workshop up here, and one of the things that came out of it was we want to look at accreditation and certification as one of the potential tools for kind of achieving people's different aspirations around social, economic, cultural and environmental aims. Because of my experience in certification, two loud voices start shouting at each other. One is, that's such a great idea, certification is awesome, it can do a lot of great things, and the other voice goes, run away. Certification is horrible, it makes everyone fight each other, it's costly, and it just allows big businesses to put a stamp on something and tell everyone they're doing good. Both are true. I've lived through both, I've seen both happen, so hopefully what I'll present today will help break down some of the really basic aspects of certification, so that if groups here do want to go forward and kind of pursue that, you'll have a few guideposts to kind of fall back on to make sure that it's something that actually achieves the outcomes that you want to achieve. So I'm going to cover this in two sections. One is, what are the two kind of fundamental aspects of certification, and that's the concepts of trust and impact. I'll talk through a few of those, and then in the second part, when I speak after a break and after some other speakers, I'll talk about making it work, what's actually involved, why have some worked well, why have some not worked so well, but also, probably more importantly, why does certification seem to work really well, like the same certification label seem to work really well for some producers and not so well for other producers, and try and talk to the complexities of it, but also make it kind of clear that it's not rocket science. You just need to have some kind of key things in mind. So the first bit, again, trust and impact. A little bit about greenwashing, fair washing, social washing, all those sort of things, and some examples. And the examples I'm going to, so first and foremost, I'm not an expert in bush foods by any stretch of the imagination. I know very little about Kakadu plum. I know very little about most bush foods. But the examples I want to give will come from my experience working in other supply chains like coffee and forestry, cocoa, tea, sugar and cotton. And hopefully, while at first you might go, what the hell does a coffee grower in Peru have to do with what we're trying to do here? Hopefully, by the end you'll see the lessons that can be learned from some of those experiences and how they've played out. So a little bit quickly about Impact Seed. I'll warn you now, I have a horrible, quite frequently mentioned habit of putting way too much information on the slide. So you might not see all of it. You can get copies of this off Aisha or get in contact with me, and I'll try and talk through as much as I can. And if you have any questions or what's that thing, just feel free to put your hand up and I can answer. Impact Seed, don't bother trying to read all that. Essentially, we're about supporting in WA the growth of businesses that do good. And not just, when we say that, I don't mean just businesses who do some good things. Some of the most horrible companies in the world donate money to good causes. We're talking about businesses that are structured and built to do good. They make a profit, they're social enterprises, they trade, they provide services, but at the heart of what they do, they also have a social and environmental impact. And those two aren't necessarily trade-offs. If you're not making your social impact or your environmental impact that you set out to do, that's considered for that business as big a failure as not making a profit. And so that's what we're trying to grow in WA in a number of ways. About me, I'm originally from the East Coast, grew up far north New South Wales, now live in Perth on Wajo country. I used to be the Deputy CEO and Head of Standards with the Forest Stewardship Council Australia, and I used to be the National Business Development Policy Manager with Fair Trade, which are two of the most recognisable global eco-labels, for want of a better term. And I'll talk through those examples as I said, but I've had the privilege of working across all aspects that certification can possibly get involved in. So promoting, raising awareness of a label, advocating for the label, but also through forestry, actually writing the standards, managing negotiations between environmentalists, Indigenous groups, unions, industry, loggers, and so very much also how the sausage is made, not just trying to sell the sausage at the end of the day. I am a dad to a little girl there, Ella, who is 11 months, 4 days, and exactly 1 hour and 33 minutes old. Not that I'm counting, and she just said her first word last night, which I just missed out on, but I'm still pretty excited about it. So certification. What and why? I should probably preface this by saying I'm not talking about the kind of certifications you might get through government or through the Australian Standards Authority. Things like, if you're running a commercial kitchen, for example, I'm not talking about getting your kitchen certified for health reasons and that sort of stuff. I'm talking about privately run labels that are not, no one is required by law to sign up to, but people do. So what we kind of call voluntary governance, essentially. So I'm talking about these labels that have come about in order to promote or distinguish businesses or supply chains or products that are doing some sort or have some sort of benefit or aren't doing bad things, are not causing particular harm, and distinguishing those from products in the market that aren't. So really, really quickly, products or organisations that have been verified for meeting a set of agreed standards across environmental, social, economic and cultural. But more importantly, why do they get certified? Like I said, these are voluntary. No one makes Cadbury sign up to the fair trade system. No one makes Kimberley Clark, one of Australia's largest producers of toilet paper and hand towels and things like that, sign up to be certified. And being certified has costs. It has financial costs. It has the costs of actually complying and having auditors come and check all your records and check your products. So why do they do it? And the simple answer is that there's a lack of trust between businesses and consumers. And there's also a lack of trust between businesses and businesses. But why do we have a lack of trust? Because over time, through a range of campaigns, whether you're talking about in the 90s where people were promoting the use or campaigning against the use of CFCs in fridges and aerosols and things like that because of its effect on the ozone layer, through people talking about promoting recycled. Certification has come about because people have slowly become aware of the impacts, the negative impacts that are occurring through products they use. And so certification marks becomes a kind of an access for businesses to those consumers who actually care, or who want to at least not feel too guilty when they walk out of Coles. So again, it's all about it's about awareness and a lack of trust. So some examples of certification around trust. So you see all these all the time. One is, and it's a It's one of the oldest forms of some sort of voluntary or enforced certification on this, and this is just labelling around where something comes from to prove that something is made or produced in a particular area. And whole, there's been international trade fights over how you define these things. And that's all for government, it's for businesses and for lawyers. The average consumer just wants to know that the product came from the place they want it to come from, and that there's some verification in the back end that they can trust on that. Another one is that's very, very common, sometimes a little narcissistic, if you ask me, is that trust that a product doesn't contain certain things. So organic being the most obvious one, it's about the product not containing certain chemicals. So that's less about, sometimes people support it because of an environmental impact that they want to have, but more often than not, it's because it's about their own, what they're putting into their body, or what cotton garments they're using for their children, for example. So this is about impact on the person themselves. So it can be a little bit, like I said, narcissistic, and I'll use an example of that a little bit later on to talk about some of the problematic kind of focus on that and why it can be used to shift people's attention away from the impact of producing a product on who's actually producing it and making it, where it comes from in the environment, things like that. So a few examples of impact and how certification works there. So up in the far right, you've got Yarra Water there, which is Supply Nation certified. That's an example of a certification around who benefits from a product, i.e. who owns the business. Another example, we've got the notepad with the FSC label. Again, it's all about conservation, protection of forests, or responsible management of forests, but also includes a range of social and economic parts to it as well. The Ben & Cherries ice cream down there, you can see the little, I don't know if this actually has a pointer on it. That's right. Down in the bottom right there next to the cow, there's a little, black, blue and green logo there. That's the fair trade mark, and that's about fairness in the supply chain and making sure that the growers, so in this case it's actually sugar and cocoa and vanilla, I think, making sure that they actually got paid a fair price for what they do. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute, particularly around the process of, oh God, we've got a problem. How does it relate to production and products? Is certification right for it? Okay, how does that work? And I'll talk to that in a bit. Another part of certification, now I did say that these are voluntary certifications that no one is being legally forced to sign up to. There's plenty of examples of companies being boycotted until they sign up to a certification. And so more often than not, certification is about going above and beyond what the legal minimum is for a product. However, there are lots of cases as well where voluntary certification is also about the legal minimum. That could be a lack of enforcement and a lack of incentive for businesses to make sure that the people they're working with are meeting the legal minimum. So a couple of examples of that. So the fair trade mark, again, does a lot of work in child labour and cocoa supply chains coming out of West Africa, as an example. Child slavery is illegal in these countries. It is absolutely illegal, but they don't have the resources to enforce those laws. Certification provides another mechanism for supporting the enforcement of that and some tools for actually fixing it when it occurs. Another example just out of Australia, so in textile supply chain, so the making of garments here, we actually have a national law around what's called the Home Workers Code of Practice. So I don't know if you know much about when t-shirts are made or undies are made or socks are made, but a lot of the time it's not always all made in the factory. Sometimes some of that work is actually contracted out to people who are doing it from home. Now, there's legal laws around that Home Workers Code of Practice and the way that the conditions that they work, the hours that they work, what they're paid per garment, safety, a bunch of other things. Very hard to trace, very hard to enforce. Voluntary certifications, the Ethical Clothing Australia has been set up to help businesses navigate that and enforce it. But it also means that businesses kind of should bear some of the cost of making the person at the other end of the supply chain comply and pay these fees and meet these standards. And I think that is something that actually potentially has a lot of relevance for what Peter was just talking about as well. So putting it back to the businesses further up the supply chain to actually be incentivized to pay and make sure the way they work with people sourcing products isn't incentivizing or promoting unsustainable harvests, for example. Really quickly, because I'll talk about this again later, but a little bit of context. So what makes, like I said, sometimes certification doesn't work for everyone. And there's a lot of certification, quite frankly, that's out there. I won't say which ones, but there's a few up there that are, they're almost a waste of time, in that all they're doing is making businesses keep stricter records so that an auditor can tick the box. Like, they're not actually having an impact. Or what impact they're doing is minimal, and potentially you could argue might have already happened or happened even if the certification didn't exist. So what are the ingredients for making sure certification actually has an impact? One is you need awareness of the problem. Two is credibility. There's a lot to unpack in the concept of credibility, and I'll talk about it in a little bit later. But what I will say is it's highly contextual. So credible to who is a really important question. Certification is worth naught if there's no awareness that it exists. So the whole point is the reason you use it as a tool to get people to buy or get businesses to sign up is that customers recognise it. So you need to build that brand awareness. You need products. There's plenty of certification systems that have tried to get up off the ground and went and promoted their, you should look for this label when they only had a few products available. So consumers went, yeah, sure, went to the local supermarket. Too hard to find the product, so why bother? So then they don't believe in it and it goes away. So that's really important. But chicken egg also needs customers. Like I said, brand awareness needs not just awareness of the brand, but you need people who are willing to purchase it. Sometimes pay a little bit extra. All these things interrelate, and I'll talk about them later, but just wanted to use them for a little bit of context. So, feel free to say slow down if I'm talking too fast. I'm a nervous fast talker sometimes, so feel free to just say, wait, slow down. There was some research by an organisation in the late 90s, I think it was, and looked at why is there this lack of trust between consumers and businesses regarding their environmental and their social impact? And two, why do so many consumers report being absolutely confused about the whole thing? And so when they looked at all of the different examples of businesses who are muddying the waters or making things worse, they worked out that these are the kind of things that are happening. So this is what they call the 7 sins of greenwashing. And but this doesn't have to be about environmental, this can be about social aspects, it can be about economic aspects and economic fairness, and it can most certainly be about cultural aspects as well. One is, so I'll talk through these quickly. One is the hidden trade-off. So suggesting that a product is sustainable based on one or two parts of it, but ignoring the other parts of it. So, like a really simple example, organic certified cigarettes. Yes, they're good. They've been grown without chemicals, but and so they kind of focus on that bit. Sin of no proof. Any environmental or social claim that's not actually backed up, and I'll give an example of this in a minute. Sin of vagueness. This is a really common one. So all natural. You see it on products all the time. What does that mean? Arsenic is natural. So, there's a lot of other ways of growing things that technically are natural but actually harmful to the environment. So it's being really vague about what you're claiming. Sin of irrelevance, could be true what you're claiming around something being environmentally responsible, but it might have absolutely no weight whatsoever. Just trying to think of a good example right now. I haven't seen this for a while. I did see a few packets in Coles maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Gluten-free beef. That was a thing. Who cares? So it's making a claim and putting a thing on it to try and kind of make people go, oh, that's a good brand. Look, they're doing good things, when the claim you're making has no relevance whatsoever. Sin of the lesser of two evils. Again, probably the organic certified cigarettes are a good example of that. The sin of fibbing should probably be number one. That's just flat out lying. Happens all the time. The problem with, one of the reasons why certification is potentially really positively impactful is that it is so easy to lie as a business, particularly if you're at the other end of the supply chain, and completely claim complete deniability of knowing that something was wrong. Happens all the time because of the way that supply chains and who owns what have become so convoluted. It's really easy for a business at one end to go, yep, does this and this and this, and then it turns out that that's not the case, and they go, well, that's not what we were told. But certification is about an end-to-end verification process that helps to deal with that and actually put responsibility across everyone. Finally, sins of worshipping false labels. This is related to the fibbing one, in that, and I'm going to show an example in the next slide, where you see it on products quite a bit, thankfully not as much as we used to, where you might put on your packaging a little logo or something that looks like it's separate from your design and artwork and the way your branding works. And so, unless you don't actually look at it closely, you might think that there's some sort of stamp of approval on that product, but when you look at it and actually look at it, you realise it's not, it's just a mark. Like they've just put another little thing on the product, and it happens all the time. So thanks to all those sort of things, there's a lack of trust. So only a third of consumers basically say that they feel like they can believe what most businesses are saying when they say they do good things. And that's not including all the businesses who don't bother saying anything, which is actually the majority, particularly when you're talking about on the product shelf. So, a little bit of context. So, I want to preface this by saying I know nothing about this brand that I'm about to use as an example. I found them by Googling Kakadu Plum Cosmetics. And they came up because they've just launched a product literally in the last 2 months, and they're based in America. So I don't know where they're getting the products from, so I don't know. It could be that they're sustainable or not, but I want to point out how this is marketed creates that confusion and makes it harder for businesses to distinguish themselves in the market. So if anyone here is working with them, I'm sorry, but it was just an obvious example for me. So a couple of things. You can see that little logo down on the left there. That's an example of a logo that's been put on something, and people just see, oh, it contains organic, and it sits far enough away. It is the same colour, but it's a circle, and people assume that it's some sort of certification. Not everyone does, but a lot do. On the back of the product, we've got these other things. So healthy, safe, natural. I'm not sure if you can see that. Proudly made in the USA. It's a woman-owned business. Feel beautiful guarantee. Like that's a label on the guarantee that you will feel beautiful. All right. What does that even mean? And so for me, they're obvious. And again, I don't know these guys. They might be really good, but like the way they've promoted it means I can't trust them without doing my own research. And the whole point of certification is to remove the onus on the consumer to have to go and research a supply chain. They have something that they can trust. Now, I talked before about awareness as being awareness of a problem being an important precursor to being able to create or use certification as a lever to try and fix it. And this is part of that. So this is all taken from their website, except let's call him, I don't know, White Fabio, down in the right-hand corner. He's just a Google image from somewhere. So this is their promotion. So this is from two sections of their website. One is their blog post promoting the release of this new product, and the second bit in the little thought bubble up there is from their FAQ page. So their frequently asked questions part of their website. So the first one is, I don't even want to say it, Cackadoodle-doo, the new wake-up call for your skin. And then there's a bunch of stuff under that. And then I've skipped to their bit where they talk about good for the planet. And I'll read this out because I want to point to a couple of things. So Kakadu plum extract is not just good for your skin, it's good for everyone. Kakadu plums are the epitome of a socially responsible, sustainable crop. Isolated Indigenous communities who already have access to this wild-growing plant cultivate and harvest the fruit, which creates jobs and helps establish horticulture as a sustainable industry where they grow. Now, if I'm an average consumer, I'm probably going to take that on face value. But anyone who works in any social space, for example, knows that not all jobs are created equally. So talking about the example that I know from having worked in it, coffee and cocoa, comes from farmers who own their own farms, who work their butts off, and so therefore have jobs. Yet they're all losing money from that product. But unless you know that that's a problem, you'll just go, oh, jobs, awesome. It's not made easy when politicians just love to say it's all about jobs, 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 without saying, well, some jobs are better than others. Are they fair jobs? Are they appropriate jobs? And what does it mean by that? So again, I don't know about where they're getting it. It might be the case. I don't know much about this, but just as a consumer, I would take their word for it. Now, looking at you go to their frequently asked questions part of their page. Now, when you write frequently asked questions for your website or for a thing, part of it is, there's a degree of like, well, these are the questions we want you to ask, absolutely, but they are genuinely usually the questions you're expecting to be asked. Now, if you're being asked certain questions, it means that people are aware of a problem. They can't ask you the question if they're not aware there's an issue about something. These are there's a bunch of questions around, what happens if I leave the makeup on too long, that sort of stuff. I can't answer any of that, as you can probably tell from my skin. These were the only two questions on there that I could find that might be related at all to the social and environmental credentials of the products. So this gets to the awareness bit. So this is what people are aware of. So one is the palm oil side of it. Quite rightly, there's been a lot of awareness raised about the issues around palm oil. And the other one was about why isn't it vegan certified. And then this little We Care logo that they've got, they've got a whole page on it, but it's all about donations to local education, things like that, which is awesome, good. But taken as a whole, like if I'm not aware that there's a problem around Kakadu plum, or even a problem around the sourcing of ingredients, I'll just look at this website and go, this is an amazing business who are really socially and environmentally responsible based on the things I'm aware of. Awesome. For myself who has worked in supply chains and knows all the hidden traps and what actually happens, I see this and go, this is really problematic. I don't know where this stuff's coming from. I'm aware through 2 minutes of Google that there are issues around Kakadu plum. I have no way of telling whether or not this business and where they're sourcing is part of the problem or part of the solution. It's just too hard to tell. So we're doing okay for time. So I want to give an example about the fair trade label. I talked about those ingredients previously, and that's around awareness, products, customers, brand awareness and credibility. And this is, I tried to break this down into 4 simple considerations so that if you're going, all right, we want to engage in certification, these are the things you would have to answer. One is you have to identify the problem. So in the case of coffee, what we know about global Arabica coffee is that the majority, so I think it's more than 80% of Arabica coffee is actually grown by small holders. It doesn't come out of plantations. The majority of those guys all fit in between those 2 red lines there, where if you know anything about geography, that's some pretty poor areas of the world where poverty, particularly regional poverty, is fairly endemic. This is despite, at different times, I don't know what it is right now, but I know over the years, coffee as a commodity has been worth more than oil. Like, it is a massive commodity on the global stage. Like, tons of money is made out of it. It is traded viciously on the stock market as a commodity. But at the other end, you've got all the people who grow it still, being in extreme poverty conditions, many in just poverty conditions. So you go, all right, well, that's obviously a problem. So what's the relationship to production? What is it about the supply chain, the way it's produced, who's buying it, who's selling it, that is contributing to that being a problem or in the way of fixing it? One is that the producers are smallholders. Now, that's not a bad thing. I'm a big supporter of smallholder farming. But what it means that in this hotly traded commodity, they are price takers, which means they have no influence at an individual level as to how much they are paid for their coffee. They take what they're given, like a lot of farmers do. They're forced to deal with what they call in South America coyotes. So these are the traders who go around and go from farm to farm, many neighbours, drive the coffee price down and then buy it all up. Basically making neighbours and families compete against each other and bringing the price down. All right, they're the problems. That's how it relates to production. How do we fix it? So one, we want to ensure that they receive a fair price, i.e. we want them to get a price for their coffee that covers what it actually costs to produce. So they calculated that, I think it was like $1.25 per kilo or something. That's what it costs the average farmer to produce it. Many of them were getting 60 cents a kilo. So, all right, if you're buying the coffee as fair trade and you want to put the label on it, you have to buy it either at the global coffee price or the fair trade minimum, whichever's higher at the time. So you can see an example there. The green line up here, that's the fair trade price, and the actual, the grey line is the global coffee price. And so that's what farmers were paid historically if they were getting it as fair trade certified. So whenever it went below that cost of production, the traders agreed to not go below that to support the farmers. The other part, so no one said, all right, well, no more smallholders because that's not working. But if you wanted to purchase it as fair trade, you had to help the farmers organise into collectives to sell it as a group, giving them more bargaining power, better economies of scale, easier to deal with environmental management aspects of it, and mean that they can also make decisions around investing and also training each other and getting the quality of the product up. So that was a really important intervention. But that's all well and good. We've written these standards down. You should do this. Great. But what's the actual mechanism for making that happen? It has to be demand-led. So one is through the late 90s and the early noughts, and still ongoing, not fair trade, but organisations like World Vision, Oxfam, aid organisations, ran campaigns about the issue around your cup of coffee. So we've got a Hollywood actor there. I probably spent 5 minutes, put the t-shirt on, took it off, but raising awareness for the fact that coffee growers are not getting paid a fair price. And this is a really important point I want to make about certification. This is important about partnerships and who's telling what story. In those campaigns, so by Oxfam, by World Vision, they said, all right, you're now aware of it, here are the things to do. You can write to Nestle and say, what are you doing? You can write to your local member and say, look, why aren't there rules that make sure, products are ethical? And 3, buy fair trade. So fair trade became the call to action for those other organisations. There's a really important thing here, and that is you had one group who were well known and people knew they existed, who were responsible for telling the bad story. That meant that the farmers and the growers and the traders doing the right thing could focus on telling their positive story about what they're doing, who they were, where they were from. And that's a really important distinction, because it's really hard to do both at the same time, particularly when a consumer's got the attention span of a brick, basically. So that's that bit. So I think we're up to the breakdown. I think Jeremy is going to speak. Ignore that for now.
If we could hold off any questions, because Daniel will present again after lunch, but thanks for that, Daniel. I'd like to call up the Yuraman ladies, the Yuraman women. I'm with 2 mics, oh my gosh. Sorry. The Yuraman Women Bush Enterprises, a social enterprise project focusing on cultural health, bush foods, art, design, and on-country experience in the Kimberley. Yuraman women have been working on the harvest of traditional plants for food and health products since 2005, with a distinct brand and range sourced from bush plant ingredients. These products express and share Yuraman women's traditional knowledge and provide practical health benefits to users. Products range from skin and healthcare products to teas, spreads, seeds and spices derived from traditionally used plants, including the iconic boab. Annie, Nanya, Milgan, Jackie Shubler, Tara Shubler, Davina Sampi, and Robin Wells. Okay.
My name is Jenny. I'm a Nigano lady, and I started in a modern way, like how I start this bush medicine. I want to start making bush medicine. I wanted to start that, and it was really interesting for me. but our old people gave us our knowledge and showed us which tree, how to use it, what it's for. So, it started a long time ago, and I didn't know how to start my bush medicine, like doing it in a modern way. So had to get Robin well. She was the first that we started off with our ointments, and we started all the different ointment, and we also before we we had to test it ourselves on those medicine, and but like long time old people used to knew about this plant, and they never had a tool how to use it, but all they knew about like the plant that they knew, how to inhale it, and some of them like greenbow, it's a bloodroot sap. They used to use that, and all different kinds of plant. And now that for me, I was really interested, and that's how I started making ointment with Robin Well, and we both worked and we tried, and it's really it was really like, for example, greenbow, we're using it, trying it on, and like all the different plants. So so now that we are all doing, and like I was teaching them and did a workshop, and now it's like Mandy here. So we all work together as we are on the Yearman, as a woman. We got a women program, and that's what we do. And so we've been learning a lot. We've been working together, and that was, not an encouraging Malangina, but one majority. So I see everybody do that now, doing ointments today. So that's all I can say.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline Shabra. I work for the Rangers. I'm a women's head Rangers, and I'm part of the Human Women's Project. So I work with bush medicine and with plants. So we've been going out country. First we started just working out on country, trying out the different bush medicines. We had Robin Wells here to guide us along on how to make the ointments and all the bush medicines by using some other stuff added into our bush medicine. So we've been making healing ointments, chest rubs, foot balms and soaps. Yeah, so we've been in this program for how many years? Yeah, for a long time, and yeah, so not only we make bush medicine, we take kids out on the country, teaching them how to work with bush medicine and sharing the knowledge along, on how which bush medicine work with what. So just love that. Yeah, so.
Hi everyone, I'm Robin. Jacqueline's got a sore back there, so she's going to take a seat. Yiraman, just a bit of background, has been going for about 20 years, and the women have been doing a wild harvest project for many of those years. And about 2017, we had a business plan to do some social enterprise. So the work that you see here is being now done systematically. And if you take the time during the break to have a look at those models over there, you'll see that it's not just a commercial enterprise, it's a cultural enterprise, and our model is completely based on being strong in knowledge and culture, language and law, working on country, so learning from country, teaching on country and sharing knowledge on country, respecting country, looking after it while we're using it, and also being in right relationship with each other. And all of those are really important. That's our way of working. So any of the steps that we take through any enterprise that we do has to be done within that framework. So there's a little. Oh, that's better. Sorry. There's a poster up there that says "What's in an ointment?" So if you look at a jar of ointment, it might be good for your feet or it might be good for your face. But actually what we're really looking at is to make that ointment, you have to be grounded in cultural and traditional knowledge, to know what plants to use, to have to be working in the right way with the right people to collect that plant, asking the questions about who has the stories, the deeper stories to tell about that plant, who has the right to collect it, the incredible opportunities there are for when people are making this ointment, like for children and so on, for the sharing of that knowledge, to be, how do you be out in the country, what sustainable collection practices, what do we have to need to be compliant, do we need plant collection licences. So if you have a look up there and you just see there's just in that one jar of ointment, there's an incredible opportunity and responsibility in making that product. So in terms of what we're talking about today, which certification, I'll put this up on the wall later, but this is sort of where we've got to in asking the questions about when we're using a product and branding it. Our aim is actually not to make big waves commercially, but for these products to be used for the well-being of people in community first and foremost, and then go out into the wider community. There's been a lot of talk about how supply chains and so on. Yiraman's actually not so interested in that. We're interested in how that product can be, sort of the joys that can be gained from people collecting that plant, understanding, if you like, the plant goodness and the magic of that plant while they're collecting it, while they're producing it, and distributing and using it and making it part of your own life in community. That's actually the basis of the Yiraman project first and foremost. So in terms of developing a product, we've spent a lot of time thinking about branding, and this is by no means a final branding, but this is in terms of gaining consumer trust, and that's really trust of people in the community as well, is that you need to be giving it information about where it was collected, who collected it, whether it's sustainably collected, how much is in there, what the ingredients are you making any false claims, all of those sorts of things. So we've looked very carefully at that. This is a basic prototype of what that might look like. all of this raises very complex questions about working with intellectual property. I think people have mentioned today, what that cultural ownership is and how that cultural knowledge is shared. We're an organisation that works across 4 language groups, so there's questions that are raised about if we're using a plant that's widely used across the Kimberley, lots of language groups might be using that plant. So how do you build relationship? If we're making an ointment, what about other people in other areas who are using that ointment? If you're selling an ointment, what does that exposure of that plant do for other language groups who are using it? How do you share your intellectual property amongst the different language groups that are part of Yiraman? How do you meet intellectual property with staff members that are working with you, working with consultants and so on? So there's very, very complex issues that we're working our way through. We've met with Daniel Robinson and Margaret Raven, and we'd love to work more closely with local groups in the Kimberley to answer some of those questions. Is there anything else?
I'm going to get started on the second half and try and get through some of it a little bit quickly because we're keen to kind of get some discussion happening and get some feedback and thoughts from people and capture those on a few things. As Aisha said at the start, this is a follow-on from a workshop that happened a while ago. It's part of a broader project that UNSW is also part of, and I want to make sure that I haven't wasted everyone's time, and that this is potentially a point for either people being able to make a decision individually or collectively that certification is a potential tool or that people want to go forward with, and what are the next steps and what might it look like. So I want to kind of get through this stuff to get to that. And this second part of the presentation is designed around that because it gets a little bit more to the mechanics. And I also want to give an important example about that is not just about certification, it's about an organisation that is certified, but the way they approach it makes sure they get a really good impact. So using the recipe ingredients analogy, I'll talk about those things like awareness in a little bit of detail now. I'll talk about this Cafe Feminino, which is the case study I want to kind of spend a couple of slides on. Sorry. Then an example of a certification that is, and I'm not going, this is a certification you should use, but it's probably the most obvious global certification that has an approach and a focus in terms of the products that you guys are talking about. So I want to kind of just talk about them a little bit, but to raise awareness about them, but also to show a little bit of the internal mechanics of how a standard in a certification actually works, because it's important to know a little bit about that to know whether or not that's something you want to get into, because you're talking about really, really boring documents and spending a lot of time in them. Finally, who pays? So the business of certification, like how does it actually work? Someone's got to pay for this. How do certifications operate? And then some considerations and some thoughts about where you might go, and or at least what you need to think about from my perspective about whether or not certification is a path forward. So the ingredients. So I mentioned these before, but I want to talk about them a little bit more specifically now. And I've already talked about awareness of the problem, like why you need that for certification to actually have some sort of impact in what it's trying to do. The only two notes just on top of what I've already said on that. Again, one, there's a really important role for NGOs and campaigners, and they don't just have to be NGOs and campaigners, but also other businesses. One of the ways that consumers or businesses or any kind of end user of a product learns about that product being available is through other businesses. So having other businesses as champions is really, really important. And I talk a lot about consumers just because it's the most obvious and it's the most common sort of use of labels or certification on products. But I just want to point out that it's actually not the only one. It's not the only use for it. There's a lot of certification. Supply Nation's a good example of it, where the focus isn't, or the target audience isn't consumers, it's actually businesses as users or procurers of a product. So I just thought I should also mention that. Credibility should have, if I was giving a longer presentation, credibility, that row there, would have about 10 slides. Credibility is everything in certification. Talking about trust and impact. Trust and hence credibility, that's the thing that certifications trade in. That's all they have to offer. Like fair trade is nothing to the businesses that it is trying to get certified to improve the life of farmers if it's not considered credible. And that's credible to consumers, it's credible to other businesses, credible to expertise in the areas, credible to industry. And there's so much about that and what it means to be credible in this space that a lot of money, a lot of time has been spent on defining it and writing codes of practice all just around the concept of credibility in certification and standards. Like, it's a really, really important thing. But it can also be boring as hell. So it's only one row here. And I will, when we share all this stuff, I'll pass on a couple of documents to Aisha that explains and goes into a bit more detail. Sorry, just had lunch. About credibility. But just to give you an example. So ISEAL, ISEAL, so that's the International Social Environmental Accreditation and Labelling Alliance. And it's kind of people call it the certifier of the certifiers, and it kind of is, but it's not a really good way of describing it. What I would say is it's the peak body or umbrella organisation for good quality certification and standard schemes to come together, define best practice, not overlap and kind of butt heads too much, because duplication doesn't benefit anyone, but kind of raise the game and make sure there's not a level playing field, but an appropriate benchmark about what it means to be a good quality standard and a good quality certification scheme. And for that reason, there's a bunch of labels, some who have appeared throughout this who aren't in ISEAL because they don't meet it. And if you want to go down the rabbit hole of certification, ISEAL is the place you start to understand, to start differentiating between the good and the not so good. But even then, so there's a bunch of aspects around what it means to be a certification system, what it means to be a standard. So and these are all sources of credibility. So one source of credibility is who's behind the standard, who actually sits on the board of this organisation, how independent are they of the people that they're certifying, or how do you allow involvement of the industries who get certified into the governance, but in a way that's not, the cliche of the fox ruling the henhouse or whatever it is. So that's one way. So that's one source of credibility. Another source of credibility is how you write the standard. It was brought up before. Who was engaged in the writing of this, that, or the other? It's really important when writing certification that engagement of affected and interested stakeholders is a key part of it. Who writes the standard? Who sits on your standard committee? Who's involved in writing what people are going to be forced to follow? That's what I managed in forestry. I managed the Standards Development Committee for Australia's first forest stewardship standard. And really, really tough work, very, very rewarding. But we had 9 people around the table who do not agree, but it was all having them there together was what made that standard credible to other people, because they knew that they were represented on that group. It was really, really important. Credibility about the actual content of a standard, again, really, really key. Is it a bunch of vague nonsense? Is it overly prescriptive? Is it not prescriptive enough? Like, these are all sources of credibility. For one, on the prescriptiveness, if a standard isn't too prescriptive and it's got big loopholes, then it's not credible to people who are trying to drive change. If a standard is overly prescriptive and really, really specific, saying you must do X and Y, then it's not very credible to businesses because they need flexibility, because not every business is the same. So this is a really, as you can see, like, it's a really fraught area, but it's super important. Credibility about how you allow businesses to talk about the certification and what it means to be certified. Again, gets to the credibility in the eyes of the consumer. Really, really important. And so I still came up with these 10 credibility principles. Each of those principles has a specific definition for each of those different parts of the standard and certification system. And there's more than a few areas where they directly contradict one another. So what it means to be credible around rigour has at its core some tension against what it means to be credible about accessibility. But that's the point of coming together and putting all the time into a standards development process, is to work out where that tension is and work through it. And this is my other way of saying is building a certification, if you want it to be a credible one and have impact, is bloody hard work. So that's really important. But again, it's really, really contextual because it's about to who and the product and the context. So what's credible for coffee might not be credible for timber, but it's about how you get there. So brand awareness, already talked about that. Products, again, like, products need to be available. There's no use creating a certification system or using a certification system if there's nothing to certify. Because it's all, at the end of the day, it's about the products. And again, you're not going to get anyone to get certified if there's not customers for it. So it's annoying. It's an annoying chicken and egg, but it's at the heart of it. So any movement forward or any discussions forward about the potential role of certification in the Kimberley needs to include all of these things. How are we going to raise awareness of the problem so that people seek certified product is an important question. What is credible? What's a credible certification or just a credible rules or approach in this space for the people involved and the people who are interested, and so on. So an example I want to use, staying on the coffee kind of experience, and I only decided at the last minute to use these guys in the last couple of weeks, which is unfortunate because it meant if I'd have known earlier I was going to use this specific example, I would have arranged for coffee, for this coffee to be here because it's really, really good coffee. And I forgot to have coffee at lunch, so now I'm really thinking about coffee. So Cafe Femenino. So again, this is about coffee farmers under the fair trade system. So this isn't so much about the certification system. It's about a group making the most of an existing certification system. So again, this same flow-through problem, identifying the problem. What's the relationship of the product or the business to that problem? And what's your intervention and what's your mechanism for making all that work? So in this case, the problem identification here is about gender. And it started off in Peru, and what they found and what was happening was that, again, smallholder farmers in cooperatives as a whole starting to get more money thanks to the fair trade system. However, within that group, women were still behind for a range of reasons. Some of it cultural, some of it men are pricks, some of it just that's the way they've been doing business for ages. And so what came out of that? Well, first I'll say, what was the relationship between the lack of gender improvement or improvement in kind of gender-related KPIs or measurements, whatever you call them, with the production? So what they identified as being the problem, as smallholder farmers, as the people managing them, women weren't involved in any of the management. They were only involved in picking. And so what they did was they came together and formed Cafe Feminino. So the idea of Cafe Feminino was that, so you've already got these cooperatives that are selling their coffee under the fair trade system into the global fair trade market. They created their own program within that, and essentially, I think it pretty much started as a business. Now there's a business and a foundation, where they would create their own brand on top of that and sell their product through that brand. So the women would run that brand, they would own that brand, and they would manage the business related to that and the sourcing of the product, the training, all that stuff. And so working with a couple of roasters and importers, they created awareness for that brand. And so it's now got a new brand. So you can see the orange circle here, Cafe Feminino. But so Jasper Coffee, they're a Melbourne-based coffee roaster. You can see, I mean, what I'll say about Jasper is that they are the opposite in terms of using labels to that skincare company I used before. All the little marks on that, they're all specific third-party credible certifications. Like their packets are littered with the bloody things. I think there's too many. But what they have there is under the Peru decaf, that's the name of their brand, they've got the Cafe Feminino mark. It's also fair trade certified, also organic certified, all that. But they're purchasing and supporting specifically that this business and program initiative. And one of the reasons I want to kind of use these guys as an example, one is they are fantastic. Like I had the opportunity to do a bunch of presentations and talk about these guys a lot in a previous job. And of all the case studies I always used to use, this was always my favourite because the stories out of Cafe Feminino are amazing. Like I got to talk to an importer from Australia who used to go over there every couple of years, and when they first started, the women, I think it was only 9 or something in their first meeting, and they sat around in the shed. The women barely held eye contact with them. Like they had been, I'm not saying trodden, but like they had not been in that position. The men held these negotiations previously. It was the men who managed the finances. It was the men who did X, Y, and Z. Within a few years, those same women were like banging the table. No, this is the price for the coffee. This is how we're doing it. You're paying it on these terms, and bugger off if you don't agree. Like those kind of stories are awesome. I love that stuff. And this is a really good example of one. The fair trade certification system helped make this happen for a few reasons. One, because it facilitated the forming of cooperatives, because that's part of its standard. It facilitated the payment of a fair price and a premium on top to be used for development outcomes. Therefore, what that meant was that when that group came together, they were able to then start using that premium to build the brand. The fair trade certification system helped facilitate the existing long-term relationships with the traders that allowed them to put the idea of the Cafe Feminino brand and have those champions on the other side of the world to promote and get them to use the license. And if you put the license on your product, you've got to pay for that license. So you're already paying for the certification, but they've done such a good job of developing that brand that you also pay for the license to use the Cafe Feminino brand on your coffee. There's only 2 companies in Australia that are allowed to use it. One is Jasper, and the other one is BioBean, based in WA. So it's a really good example of using existing certification but proactively going a step further and creating a brand so they didn't have to go and write new standards or anything. That they develop their thing. They have rules, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's just a really good mesh, and it points out, I think, gives a good guide as to the different kind of ways you can engage in certification. You don't have to come up with a new one. You don't have to not use them. There's different ways of getting the most out of them. Now, Cafe Feminino has expanded. I couldn't fit the little map of all the countries that they now have coffee cooperatives being sold out of, but there's 9 countries. I think it's 7. I think it's 6 from South America, 2 from Africa, and 1 from Asia. I might be wrong, but that's what the map looks like in my head. I'll have to double check. But it's huge now. Like, it's all over the world. They're celebrated. The flow-on effects, like if you're interested in economic development, you know the importance of gender empowerment to community outcomes, so it's had that flow-on effect, and it's really, really important. So I wanted to use those guys as a really good example for a bunch of reasons. Next one. So I want to quickly, so the Union for Ethical Biotrade, and hopefully when Dan Robinson and Margaret are able to come to Broome next, once the borders come down, Dan can talk to this a little bit better as well, because I know he's done some consulting and done some work. Sorry, I think I ate my lunch a little bit quickly. Around them, particularly around the access and benefit sharing. But this is probably, at least at a global level, the closest one that is, I would say, fit for purpose to what the kind of businesses and the kind of things that is trying to be achieved here. So UEBT, that's their old label in the top left. This is their more recent one that they've developed, which I think looks a lot better. Just under it, I only realised this the other day. I don't know how I missed it, but it's actually, so it's obviously a wolf, or I don't know which animal it is, but I didn't even realise that's two hands there, and over the top is a leaf, so I don't know how I missed it. It's quite obvious from there. All the green, that's where there's currently UEBT certified products being sourced from. So it's got a fairly big global reach. It came out of the 90s, I can't remember the year, but the UN Convention on biodiversity that Dan referred to. It's all well and good to have a convention. A few years after that, as the UN was facilitating business partnerships and working with governments, they realised there needed to be a way of engaging businesses and supply chains on the rules and the aspects of the convention. And so out of that came the UEBT, as they call it. On the right, so, and the other thing about this is what I say, the other good thing about this that I like is that if I had a key criticism of even some of the really good certification systems, the ones that I would hand on ARCO, or you can mostly trust products with that on there. You know, stuff falls through the cracks, but I would purchase that product. Even those guys haven't been able to deal with the problem where the burden of compliance, whether it's financial or through just the record keeping and maybe having to change your practices to meet a standard and all those things, that investment of resource versus the return on the resource is always a little bit skewed. It's not bad, but there's always, like, the equation is always better for the big retailer. They get more kudos out of the brand. They don't have to do much. The product comes with a label on it. They just have to pay trademark fees occasionally. Or for the manufacturer, the final kind of brand alterer, like a coffee company, for example. They have to pay. They get an order that comes in, checks their traceability, stuff like that. They have to pay a little bit for licensing fees or trademark fees. But that's about it. But they get the big benefit from access to markets or access to cafes who will only use fair trade or whatever it is. Coles and Woolworths now are slowly demanding that all paper products must have some sort of certification because everyone's so concerned about deforestation. But the rules, they get the kudos out of it. They get the greenies off their back. And they've just got to pay a bit of a fee. That's it. Like, the ones who are doing all the work are at the other end of the supply chain. All the change in product, all that happens at the other end. Plus the certification fees, plus the licensing fees. They don't quite get the return. Like I said, the equation's just not the same. What I like about these guys is that all of this is predominantly focused not on the local communities, not on the farmers, but on the people sourcing from them. Like, I think that's a really important part. Doesn't matter what product you're talking about. Like, for impact to be meaningful, we need to share the burden or the the responsibilities across the whole supply chain, and we need to share the benefits, which is what I really like about these guys. So and that's why it says this is about sourcing practices. It's not about production. It's not about how many. I was talking my old industry, which is forestry. How wide's your buffer from this creek before you can harvest, whatever. Like, it's not about that stuff. It's about the relationship between those guys. So they're standard. So most, and this is where I'll try not to put you guys all to sleep just after lunch. But this is a little bit of technical background to how standards work. I mentioned before one of the credibility tensions is rigor versus accessibility, or flexibility versus prescriptiveness, and it's a really important tension. One of the way you get over this is you use a hierarchy within these documents. So at the top of the documents you have your principles, and these are the things that everyone agrees on. It's like, yep, at a general level, this is, if all these things you can describe about a product or a business, then they meet the thing. Under each of those principles you have criteria, and this is obvious for anyone who works in policy. This is not unique to standards. This is a very common policy sort of framework. Under that you have your criteria, and that's where you get into more descriptive. You're describing the dynamics of what it means to meet that principle. And then under each of those, which I didn't have room for the reason I'm here, you have some people call them measures or indicators. There's a bunch of, but that's where they get into very specific things. Sometimes like specific to the point of describing what will not happen. Other times it might be describing a process, being able to show they have done this and prove it. And so that's how they work. So I just wanted to kind of give an example. So this is their 7 principles. So conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of it, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits, socioeconomic sustainability, and that's getting into also, because there's a lot of examples, unfortunately, of businesses with good intentions going into areas and saying, I'm going to work with these farmers, but not actually having a very good business, and so failing, and that doesn't help the farmers. So that's a really important part as well. Compliance with legislation has to be, it's included in most standards. Principle 6, benefits for rights of actors involved in biotrade, and then 7, clarity about land tenure, right use and access to natural resources. So again, this is about the people sourcing the product. It's up to them to show to the auditors, to UEBT, that when they're working with farmers or people sourcing product, picking product, that they've made sure that they're doing it in the right way, and where possible they're also supporting them to do it. And that can be financial, that can be whatever. And that's where principle 3 is so important. Fair and equitable sharing of the benefits. Like I said before, not all standards have been able to nail that across supply chains. They've got it built in as a principle. So you can see, I won't read them out. I don't know if you can read them there, but I won't read them word for word. These are the criteria, as an example, that sit under principle 3. So it's about prices. Are people paid a fair price? Living wage is a good example of that in other countries. Sourcing arrangements, trust, long-term collaboration, not just come in and go. Like, they want to build trusting relationships. Incorporation of local development needs, so supporting that sort of stuff. Again, ABS, access and benefit sharing, it's in 3.4 and 3.5 and 3.6, intellectual property. And I don't know if they've got it in this one, but other like so forestry, for example, where they get into that, they actually, and I know that ICL, who works with, like I said, above all of them, 2 big working areas they have on this is around the living wage, because it is complex at times, but also how they can do a better job of incorporating free, prior and informed consent into standards, particularly around resource extraction, but I'm not going to go into that. It's very difficult. Now, the business of certification, I've split this into 2 bits, because I think it's it's important to talk about them separately. One is running a certification scheme. These are the different things that all have to be paid for and all require constant work. Like I said, having worked in 2 national offices for global certifications, not a single one of those you can deprioritize in the bigger certifications, because it comes back to bite you and it bites you hard. I have been bit many times. But marketing and business development is constant. Assurance, auditors, making sure the quality of the audits are good, training auditors, ensuring independence of auditors, all important. So you get certification fees out of that. However, if you make your certification fees too big, no one's going to use your certification. If it's too expensive, it doesn't matter whether you're at the farm end or the business end. So that's my way of saying certification systems run on the smell of an oily rag, literally. It's a really, really lean operation. These big labels that look their own products online rarely have a team of more than 3 or 4 people for whole regions. The Forest Stewardship Council's Asia Pacific office, which is dealing with the hotbed of deforestation in Asia, I think has 5 staff. That's because at some point there's also the auditors who have to be paid. Everyone's this is where the money comes from. So it's a really, really lean model. On that, I've mentioned quickly volume model and business size. That just means there's often 2 ways of determining license and certification fees. Sometimes it's based on the size of the business you work with. Other times it's based on volume. There's pros and cons that I won't go into. And governance, standards development and maintenance. So writing good standards, which includes stakeholder engagement, all those things, having a good group, looking after that group. And then updating your standards. They're constantly getting updated because things change. And risk management through governance, through your supply chains. All of these things take a lot of time, take a lot of energy, and cost money. What's the cost of being certified? Again, marketing and business development. Yes, you've got a label on your product. If someone's out there promoting that label, that's awesome, but they're not promoting your business. They're just promoting the label. Certification doesn't promote your business. You still have to promote your business. So if it's if you are in that, and like Uriman said, this isn't where they're focused, but if you are involved and you're trying to sell into these supply chains, you're still going to need business. Or if you're one of the businesses in those business development or in those supply chains, you're still going to do that. It's like any other business. It's not taken care of for you. Like I mentioned, you have to pay your certification fees, you have to pay your license fees. A lot of systems do have ways of making it, of tiering it so it's as cheap as possible for the smaller the organisation or individual. And then compliance, you've got to have something to audit. Auditors aren't standing over your shoulder 365 days a year. More often than not, it's one audit a year. And it might be, if you're just a small enterprise, half a day. If you're a larger enterprise, it might be a week. But they need to see your records. You need to have the things they need to comply. And so all that, if you're not already doing it, is a cost. I just want to point out those things because, like I said at the start, I've seen lots of businesses think that certification was going to help them, and it didn't. And so they weren't able to make the impact they could because they over-relied on certification. And so it's really important that people don't put their faith in it. I've seen too many people put their faith in certification and lose money for various reasons. Some of the things to consider. Should you explore certification? And in this I mean everything. Should you explore creating a certification? I noticed in the Environs Kimberley slide, there was a bit there about becoming the accreditation body. That can mean a lot of different things. Is that creating an accreditation? Is it being responsible as a representative of an existing accreditation? Is it training everyone else so that when the external auditors come in, they're ready? There's a bunch of different things that can mean. So when I'm asking these questions, I'm asking it for all those possible levels of engagement. What is the barrier you want to overcome? So this is important. Like the challenge. So I use a lot of my own examples because it's all I know. But so forestry, for example. So the UEBT standard I showed you just then had 7 principles. The Forest Stewardship Council standard has 10, and it covers everything. Like workers' rights, Indigenous communities, local communities, pesticides, like all of it is environmental values, conservation values. It goes on and on and on. And to the point where all those things matter in the forest, but it's bloody complex and it's really hard. I would be surprised if someone told me to go back in time and say, tell the guys who created the forest standard what they should do differently. I would say, don't have 10 principles and just create 2 or 3 for how people can write principles in their own country so that they're specific. So in Australia, we had massive fights about workers' rights, for example, because we already have laws here and we were trying to compare apples and oranges between using the same standard for workers' rights in Australia versus workers' rights in the Congo. Using the same guidelines to write a standard, and it just made it too difficult. So if you're going to get involved in standards, either writing one or engaging in using one, try and find or write the ones that just deal with the things the 2 or 3 key things that are going to matter for the impact you're trying to achieve. And it's the 20-80 principle that people talk about, where 20% of the work, if you identify the right 20%, it'll have 80% of the benefits. Too many certifications spread themselves way too thin. Is there a market? So there's two parts to that question. Is there a market for the product, and is there a market for a certified or sustainably verified version of that product? I'm just using kakadu palm as one of many possible examples. Obviously, there's a market for it. I showed the example, because there's skincare or cosmetic companies making a ton of money. Obviously, there's a market. Is there a market for sustainable, certified products? I would say yes, but it's nascent. You have to educate the consumer. Someone needs to do that, so that's really important. And that gets to the final one. Do you have partners? One of the things, so certification, all the good certification schemes, if you look at who their members are, not who's certified, but who the member, they're multi-stakeholder. FSC has 3 chambers, economic, social, and environmental. And they come together and they have equal weight in decision making. Same with fair trade. It has people at either end of the supply chain, all part of the governance. So that bit is really, really important. But that's for creating a standard. The other part, if you're just an enterprise and you want to use certification to make the most of it, to support your business, it's really hard to go it alone. And that's why I use the Cafe Feminino example, because that was an example of people under a certification coming together to get even more out of it. There's a bunch of costs, as I show, that are involved in engaging these things. It's easier to get a better return on that effort if you're doing it in groups and together, whether it's as cooperatives, as collectives, or and it could be around marketing, training, all sorts of things. But yeah, it's all about working together. Certification is not for just solo stuff. So this is potential pathways, and this is a really unnuanced kind of example of different kind of possible approaches that you might consider. First and foremost, like I've assumed, yes, that people want to do it, because the no slide stops there. It doesn't go any further. So I've divided into 3 possible ways, but then within each of those, there's obviously a bunch of different branches. First one is you can write a new scheme and start one, which involves forming, organising, consulting, and developing. There's a pro, so the pros and cons of each of these. The pro of this one is that you potentially have ownership of all of the benefits similar. So not just being certified and having access to markets, but also owning the brand of the certification and the fees and that. So there is a good reason for people to consider that. The con of that is complex and it's slow and it's bureaucratic and it's very frustrating. I'm not saying I wouldn't do it because I honestly think that ownership of everything is a really important pro in this. Using an existing scheme to find a certification, apply for it, and get certified, and hope that it works for you. Pro, you don't have to write standards. You don't have to go through all that rigmarole. Awesome. Con, one is you might have to find one that's not necessarily fit for purpose, and two, you have to go it alone. So even with a scheme that is on paper completely relevant for the kind of products that you're talking about or that you could potentially benefit from certification, it's not. Australia is blue there. Blue means there's nothing happening. So potentially going it alone. Well, there's a danger of it. So that's the con to that one. A hybrid example of those two, and again, this is why I use the Cafe Feminino. I want to make the point as well that the Cafe Feminino, so to carry you have to pay the license fee if you're a roaster to use that label. But for the growers to be part of it, Cafe Feminino also wrote a few gender-specific requirements that sits on top of the existing fair trade requirements. And it's just things around democratic participation and a few things like that. So they still came up with their principles, but they didn't have to write a whole new standard. That one was issue-specific, so it's gender. Hence, now it can be in 9 different countries. That doesn't mean that people can't do one that is product-specific or geographically specific as well. And the geographic specific one overlaps with existing approaches to trying to develop industries in local areas. Governments throw money to develop a marketing cooperative for all the fruit growers in the southwest or something like that. It's similar to that. But yeah, that example was about gender. It doesn't have to be issue specific. It can be product specific or geographic. The pro is you don't need to write all the standards, but you still benefit from the collaboration. The con is still that early coordination, bringing people together. So, and bringing people together is not, I'm not saying is a bad thing. It just means it just takes time. So that's still an important consideration. I think that's my last slide. So I know there's still some more speakers, but we want hopefully some discussion about is certification a way forward, what people think, etc. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Daniel. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Pat to come up in a minute. Then later on, when we're finished with the last presentation, we'll go back to these questions and maybe have a little bit of a chat about these questions and get some feedback, please. So for now, I'd like to ask Pat Torres. Patricia Torres has been involved in the Australian native foods industry for more than 10 years. She has a wealth of knowledge on native plant foods and medicines, a successful businesswoman. Pat runs My Harvests, an ethical and sustainable Indigenous owned and managed native produce business. Pat is a change agent for Indigenous futures through her involvement in the Northern Australia Aboriginal Kakadu Plums Alliance and the 5 Kungas Alliance and many other groups. I'll get her to explain what that is shortly. Pat is also an author, illustrator and cultural advisor. I had too much to eat. Cultural educator. Sorry, Pat. She's a mother of 5, grandmother of 7, and has been recognised for her achievements through winning Book and Harmony Awards, the Galari NAIDOC Award, which I presented to her last year, and the Because of Her We Can Award for the Kimberley. Thank you, Pat. Thanks, Mike.
So while Aisha's doing that, I'm a shorty too, just like Daniel. So Ngaji Wariji, hello everybody. Nyambaburu Jugungan. So this is the land of the Jugun peoples, and which we share today with Yaru as a result of native title. I acknowledge the elders of this land and all the living descendants who have survived and strive to thrive. Thank you for the organisers for inviting me to be part of this, and trust that everything's been going well with the workshop. So, Ngayu Nilawal Pat Mamajun Torres, Ngaya Ngarangu Jandu Yarungan, Jabajabangan, Garajingan, Mumbal Jabajabangan, and Bardingan. So I am an Aboriginal woman from 7 Aboriginal Kimberley groups, which stretches from Bijadanga down south, which is the traditional area for Gurridgery mob, and some of our Yuraman ladies are part of that group. And we go all the way up to Biggle Bay, to Sandy Point. So I've been very privileged actually to be descended from all of those groups, because what it meant through my life is I had access to a lot of traditional ecological knowledge that was contained in my family and extended kinship groups, and they taught me so much as a child growing up. So I'm 64 now. I started being really passionate about bush tucker probably around about 12, 13, 14. And at the same time, I was also passionate about learning the deep history of our country, which meant all our Bulgarigari stories, which are the story, white fellas might say dream time. So it's our dreaming histories, it's our ancient histories of connection to country. That's why this morning I spoke very strongly about our connection, our identity, and why I think those things are important. So I wanted to talk to you today about my journey in the development of my business. So my brand is called My Harvest, and M-A-Y-I is the common Aboriginal word meaning bush foods. It doesn't include meat foods, it's basically plants, honey, seeds, flowers, those kind of non-meat foods. So if you want to say bush foods in general, you've got to say wali mai. So wali or ali is meat foods. And so my journey in my business started with the CDP. So for those of you who don't know what that is, Community Development Employment Program. It was the equivalent to what's the work for the dole today, and it was a way of getting Aboriginal people out on country to work in their lands and create a life for us away from the terrible situations that were happening in the towns and cities. And so we could actually go out onto our lands and learn how to survive in the bush, relearning our culture and history and keeping our identity strong. And we did it under work for the dole. Now in those days when we started, $100 a week we got. Wow, you know, like how can you run a business or a community with $100 a week? So it went up. By the time they cancelled CDP on us, it was $300 a fortnight. So that worked out to be $150 a week. The government gave us what's called operational funds, which meant we could buy a car or a generator, or pay for some fencing, maybe build a house from recycled materials. But it depended on how many people you had on your CDP, because every person got $2,500 as towards the cost. So you only had 2 people on your CDP, of course, that's only $5,000 a year. You can barely buy fuel for 5,000 a year. So if you had a big community like Bidjadanga or Beagle Bay or One Point, of course your CDP was much bigger and they could offer a lot more help to outstation groups, for example. And some really great opportunities happened there for families who wanted to go forward with that. So the initial CDP was about looking after your country, land management, building houses, putting in water balls. And then the last 2 years of it, the government said, okay, make a business. So you had to make a business in 2 years. So IBA decided not to support the Indigenous business growth at that time because they didn't think we could make a business with bush tucker within 2 years. And during that period of time, this was when the business called Karaji was the first Australian business that started to look at using kakadu plum. And I started out being a picker. So we had a family in town, this Sibasado family, connected with the Binomas, and so we started picking for them, and we picked for them for about 5 years, and then Crikey picked up, so Crikey was the CDP organisation that picked up the idea of having more of a cooperative system in terms of the gubbing, and we then went forward with creating family businesses, so small family businesses, and in that time we were able to get a license which could cover your whole family. Nowadays I've seen they're changing towards everybody's got to have a license if they want to be involved in the bush tucker business. But in that process, so I've been involved with the bush tucker industry for about 20 years in a commercial sense, about 10 years as a picker for the different groups that were doing it, and then the last 12 years I've been doing it myself as a small business, my Harvest brand, and last year I created my company. So I'm now Mummijan Tree Enterprises Proprietary Limited, fully owned and managed Aboriginal company, and I started out just like the Yiriman ladies. We started out as almost like a social enterprise rather than a real business, because we saw the bush tucker as being one of the industries that we could easily become involved in, because that was where our knowledge lie, that's where our experience lie, but it was also a way of maintaining our identity. It was a way of teaching our families how to do business whitefellow way. So when we say business in our communities, it's about cultural business ritual. It's not about making a dollar. However, in that traditional space, bush food was part of our economic activity. So that's why I spoke up this morning about it not being just cultural, because the bush tucker in this region was traded. So in the days when I was young, there were still ceremonies happening in this country, and people would bring along food, clothing, and stuff that could be shared and traded within Aboriginal communities, from community to community, family to family. And so when I set up my little business, it was about the same idea. I wanted to be able to trade with my own community and bring in other Indigenous families who wanted to do the bush tucker industry. Because when you look at Australia, and this is looking at that colonisation, effects of colonisation now, the bush tucker industry is one of the last things we have left in Australia that is Indigenous owned and controlled, in our mindset anyway. And so the other things of ours, being taken from us, our land's been taken, our water places have been taken, our country's been taken, all those sort of things, we have to go under the state legislation. So even though our lands were never ever given over through treaty agreements or anything like that, we're still subjected to government rules and regulations, because that's the imposed system that exists here now. But also remember that Indigenous people, we actually operate in two laws. We operate in Aboriginal law and we operate in Western law. So there are protocols that we have to abide by, which is linked to our family, our language, and our cultural connections. And then we also have to abide by the state government legislation that rules over things like forests and stuff. But I have been arguing and doing my best to have the voice to let people know that because the Indigenous people are the first inhabitants of this country, and we have actually stories that go right back to show why, like we have our own system, our own Aboriginal science, we have our own traditional ecological knowledge systems that actually says to us this is true. Indigenous people were the first peoples here, and there's probably white fella evidence to show going back about 65,000 years that we've been here versus, 240 years of occupation of Australia. So you have this big, incredible amount of knowledge owned by our peoples, and then you have this knowledge of government and nationhood and statehood where we have to be subjected to that because that's the enforcing agency that creates all the laws about certification, about HACCP, food safety, etc., etc. So my journey as through my harvest is, okay, I was there saying, okay, let's go and utilise the bushed food. It was always part of our rights, it's part of our bundle of rights. So not only is it a cultural right, but it's also an economic right. It's also a political right. So I'm opening my mouth up and talking loudly, and sometimes I make friends and sometimes people don't like me because of what I say, but that's the political situation. And I, as an Aboriginal person, luckily today I'm not shot or killed because I've opened my mouth, but in my grandmother and my mother's day they were killed if they spoke up against government or other institutions. So I'm just giving you a little quick history lesson just to show you where I'm coming from. I'm coming from this really strong Indigenous-led family. So I'm part of, I tried doing business Western way, and that's the way you have to do it if you want to commercially work in that space. I went and joined what's called the Australian National Native Foods and Botanicals industry, thinking, okay, let's go with it. I went there really raw and willing to, working with these peoples. And I went there, and this is just the first example I had. It was me and one other Indigenous woman who went there to join because we wanted to be part of this industry. We wanted to contribute. We wanted to create partnerships and collaboration. And what happened? They totally ignored us. They were really frightened of us. At that stage, there were millions of dollars being made by non-Aboriginal people in the bush food industry. And Aboriginal people today are only still 1% of the native food industry. However, it's our product, it's our people who created it, but we're never involved in any decision making. So we went there thinking naively we were going to get involved. But at the top of that ANFAB group was really strong white males, Anglo-Saxons, who were really aggressive against women in general. And then Indigenous women, they made us feel like, oh, maybe we came to the wrong place, because they won't even listen to us, didn't want to have anything to do with us. And then when they did know us, you know what they wanted? They wanted all of our knowledge. We were there to be the gurus for native foods, and they were just going to take all our ideas and run off with it. And that's exactly what happened to me, being a naive person. I went into that space. I met two of these really strong males, made friends with me, said, oh yeah, I want to create this beautiful drink product. So he created this Kakadu plum drink, and he had it all set up for sending it across to America, and then the American system went down, the economic system went down, so his product never went anywhere. But in that process, we had collected 4 tons of gubbing amongst all the families, and we didn't have a place to store it. So he said to me, I'll buy 1 ton and I'll store your other 3. So yeah, no worries, fully trusting, thinking this was going to be a real good collaboration. He came over here, took videos of us, created a website, stole our fruit for 7 years. 7 years, stole 4 tons of it. That was 80 grand in those days because we got paid $20 a kilo. Nowadays we're making a bit more, And So he took all that fruit, created this thing called Kalari Plum, and guess what? That was meant to be my brand name. I was going to create a juice or something made from the gubbing and call it Kalari Plum because we are not from Kakadu National Park. We wanted to say the gubbing that comes from the west. So I created this brand name Kalari Plum. Not only did he steal my 4 tons of fruit that the co-op had collected, he stole my name and put it on his brand, okay? He took photos and a video and put my name on his website and made out like he was cooperating, collaborating. Now, he's not the only native food company that's done that to us. There is so many in Australia. So when you talk about certification and you talk about trust, there is already 20 years of abuse towards Indigenous people with our knowledge, with our product, and our intellectual property. So I'm pleased to say nowadays that, things are getting better because now we have what's called NACPA. So NACPA is National Aboriginal Kakadu Plum, so National Australian Aboriginal Kakadu Plum Alliance. And it's not a legally constituted body yet. We're working with Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation so that we can iron out all these things we're talking about now. We have looked at things like HACCP. So we've gone through HACCP, auditing, which means, HACCP is the highest level of food grade qualification that people need to do if they're doing foods. And in the Kimberleys, of course, it's hard to find a domestic kitchen, let alone a HACCP kitchen. There's no HACCP kitchen in Broome. They're in Perth. They're in Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland, but they're not in Broome. So that's a really big barrier for us to do anything in a big way. So HACCP, we tried to do that. The other thing we looked at is, okay, for how long have our plants been taken somewhere else and sold under someone else's name and into their business intellectual property? So we've gone into with the National Measurement Institute and we've done studies on the genetics. So with the 5 companies that exist in Western Australia, there's myself, Mama Belunjan, there is Lomedina, there is also Mercedes Cove, and there was one other partner, but they've pulled out recently. So we were concerned about how are we going to own this industry, how are we going to direct this industry, and how are we going to protect our rights. So having ILSC sort of like walk side by side, they're the partners. When you're talking about partners and collaborators, ILSC walk side by side with us. They've actually paid a person a wage to be a business manager, and he looks at all the opportunities for us. So we've looked at the concept of what they call blockchain. Blockchain is where you have a producer supplying a product, then it goes to someone else, and then it goes to someone else, and then it goes to someone else. So we start here, and then it's all the way linked. So that is part of this providing quality assurance, trusting in the product and all that. So we in the West here have not decided to go forward with that yet because there's other issues that we have to deal with first. But there is a company in South Australia that's going to go ahead with that, and they're a Pippi. They're a seafood company, Indigenous owned, and it's a little cockleshell that grows in the southern areas, and the Indigenous people there are going to actually trial that blockchain process with their product. We've gone and done the genetics, and what we found in the West here is that all the gubbing trees that are grown by Mama Belunjan, because they collect seeds and they grow it on the Water Corporation land, and it's run along the same line as a horticultural plantation. So they've actually taken trees and put it on lands that never had gubbing there before, and they're growing it in reticulation. So their gubbing, when you look at the genetics of the gubbing, totally different. And their gubbing, they're actually creating their own, you could almost say, cultivars in one sense, because they've bought gubbing from all over the West Kimberley and put them all together. So when the plants start pollinating, getting pollinated and stuff, they've actually created a fruit that's different, totally different. Whereas my fruit I collect only from the Moombul Jubba Jubba area, which is north of Willie Creek and goes all the way up to Biggle Bay. But most of my collection by my family is on that below Minarine or Minari, as people say. And so that's where my fruit comes from. And my fruit is similar to the Biggle Bay ones and similar to the Lombardina ones. But this other one, where it's totally mixed up with all the things, they're totally different. And then the Gurridgery mob, they've had, we want to help them maybe get theirs looked at too. But they haven't joined the cooperative, they haven't joined the NACPA group. So NACPA, we've been going for, I think, 2 years of funding with ILSC, and we've looked at issues relating to quality. We've even had meetings in the past looking at IP, so the IP Australia is one of our partners. We went to a global, SAI Global Conference 2 years ago with the idea of understanding what it all means for certification, for food safety, and so we've gone down that journey. So, I definitely agree, with Daniel about how you've got to attack it from different ends, educating plus getting your accreditation. Now, the reason why our group, the NACPA group, is interested in accreditation is because fruit's been stolen from us. We've had people use our name. So there's how you had that name, what's it, greenwashing? Well, there's another word, it's called black cladding. It's when you use Aboriginal people as an identity and say that your product is, genuine because you're involving Aboriginal people, which is what this other guy tried to do with me, saying that he was working collaboratively with Aboriginal people and all that sort of stuff, but he was actually acting very unethically, dishonestly, and immorally, and there was no access and benefit in those days. But in the last two years, the concept of the Nagoya Protocol has been brought to us to examine and listen to, and so we're putting into practice now access and benefit control. We're doing supply agreements. So all those things are really important to protect the Indigenous person's involvement. But we're still dealing with the issue that other people think that the plant is everybody's right, when in fact it was our ancestors that created those plants, so we've got the first right. So any people who want to do business should work in partnership with Indigenous people, a collaboration. We're not against people working with us, as long as it's ethically, morally, and done with trust. I can give you so many examples of people who I now distrust, will refuse to work with them ever again. One food company who was one of the major buyers from me, I went to, this is the other way of trying to get trust, and that I went and joined Slow Food International. Now, Slow Food International is one of those big organisations globally that look after food sovereignty. So they've created a thing called Ark of Taste. So when we went there, we thought, well, let's begin to protect our Indigenous species. And I asked them if we could do the Pindan walnut, so Terminalia cunninghamii. It's one of those trees that gets destroyed by fire. And most of you who work in the Kimberley know that fire is a really big problem for us in our forest. So I put that in as the first plant we wanted to protect. And we flew over to Italy. We were part of their food industry. We met so many amazing people there. And they had more respect for Indigenous people and our product and our knowledge than I've met in Australia. So that was an eye-opener for me, because it meant that, yes, there were better days to come. So all I had to do is maintain that strong presence and be involved in making sure that something good comes out of it. I don't just want to be a survivor, of oppression in Australia. I actually want to thrive with my family. And so the only way to do that is to make sure that everything is in the right way. Like when Ariane talks about, we want to do it in this way because this is the right way for us. That's very much a part of the Aboriginal protocols. So the reason why our environment is so strong is because Indigenous people have managed the land in a sustainable way. So I've gone to the Centre for Sustainable Leadership and I did their course, you know. I went to Slow Food, I went to ANFAB, and I wasn't getting much good returning back from the ANFAB group. So we started to think about the idea of how we're going to get more Aboriginal involvement and engagement and more respectful ways of working. So we decided we set up a Kungas. So Kungas in the desert language means woman. And there was 5 of us, one from every state. So we had me from Western Australia, Raylene Brown from Northern Territory. We had Dale Chapman from Queensland. In New South Wales, we had Sharon Windsor, who does Indigi Earth. And then down in Tasmania, we had another lady who was looking at nursery. So the 5 of us got together. We joined another Aboriginal group, which was supposedly based in central Australia, and they wanted to go forward with the concept of a certification process. And when we tried to work with that young fella, but he wanted us just to be advisors. He didn't want us to be business women. So being strong black women, we said, now this is not on for us. We want to go and actually get our fingers dirty. We want to grow our trees. We want to have our nursery. We want to create our own business. So we walked away from him because it wasn't going anywhere. And the NACPA group is the only one that has actually gotten feet and traction and able to start to do things. So it's a government group. They're not going to babysit us all the time, but they're actually there to, you know, help us step up. By next year, we should have a legal body, and so the issue of, you know, accreditation is important to us too. But in the meantime, after we went to the SAI Global and we went to what's called Global Table, which is another food industry big symposium, a national Aboriginal bush foods group has been created. And if my point of view is that if any accreditation is going to happen, it should come from a group like that. We spoke with Aisha a couple of years ago about getting Kimberley bush products certified because we wanted to make sure that the Indigenous people were involved in that industry. And so I still think there's a place for the Kimberley group to do their own Kimberley local-based accreditation, but they should be part of the National Bush Foods Association that's being created now. Because for the first time, I think in the last 20 years we've been trying to create organisations that's going to drive this accreditation process and get more Indigenous involvement. For the first time now, there is an opportunity to go forward. And I brought over there in my little collection of some of my things, I've got a lot more. There are papers there giving you the contact details of NACPA, giving you the contact details for the national group, and then the CABRA. I dobbed Isha again in for that, so anyone who wants to join the CABRA network, that's there. Because I think we need diversity, you know. Anyone who wants to join ANFAB can also try down that line. After 5 years, when I left them, they actually have now an Indigenous woman who's a chairperson for ANFAB, and there's a few more Indigenous people in there. So they're slowly trying to change that really strong male-oriented culture. But they're still, see, those males are still making all the bucks in Australia. They're the ones getting the millions of dollars. So, you know, when you talked about those Kakadu plum products, we don't have a wildlife trading license or permit, so we're not selling overseas. We are only selling within Australia. We are going through the process of doing the wildlife trade organisation so that we can permit, so that we can actually sell overseas ourselves, like those coffee ladies, because then we know we'll make the money and not the middle people. See, for too long we've been the harvesters and the pickers, and we want to be business people, keeping our culture strong and our ways of doing things, but also involved in this economic Western way of doing business, because our families do suffer with very bad financial status. You know, most of us are either on the dole, on social security benefits, or like myself, struggling in a small business. So we need better opportunities, and I don't want to be a harvester for someone else all my life. We've started looking at products, so over there on the table I've got my range of Kakadu plum, and I also make bush remedies, so I do an oil, a body oil, and I also do an ointment. So the ladies from Yuraman, I gave them their first 2 workshops on making bush products, going back many years, and that's when the Annies came and then started doing their own one. And that was through the assistance of KLAC, so Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture Centre helped to pay for those ladies to get involved in the industry. So there's a long way for us to go. Native foods is a very complicated sort of industry because there's so many rules and regulations because you're dealing with food. But I don't think there's enough Indigenous involvement in the space. And I think in the next 5 years you'll see that change a lot. The PBCs that exist in the country because of native title determinations, that is one of the areas that they can build their economic outcomes on, because it is a billion-dollar industry. You know, people like China. There's a product we're looking at now, getting it examined by NMI, because people have been selling so-called Kakadu plum with a very low price. Well, we had a look at that product, and guess what? No Kakadu plum in it. So it's called food fraud. It's when people go and they say something is something, and when in fact it really isn't. So they're the issues that we have to deal with, because there is a lot of terrible business people out there who just want to make money, and they don't care about all the ethics and moral environmental issues that we as Indigenous people are concerned about, you know. So I just want to basically say that I just quickly press so that we can just see a little bit of development. That I'm not a good IoT person. I'm trying my best. Okay, to go forward. Okay. So I set up my business in the 1980s, and my company was last year called Mummigen Tree Enterprises. So Mummigen is the Mimosopsilingi, which is a coastal berry. So I'm a little red berry that grows along the coast, and I was given that name by one of my aunts when I was a little kid. So I took that on into my own. When I do stories, I use Pat Mummigen as the name, and then I also created my company with the Mummigen Tree, because that's part of who I am. That's part of my identity. It's also a bush food, and there's special ways of preparing it so that it tastes great. So in the background there, you've got the wattle seed. So when I took my kids bush, it was about getting away from Broome. Broome was a terrible place. The beginning of drugs happened in this country, so we're having to deal with a whole wave of different kinds of drugs in Broome at the moment. Every family in Broome has got one member of their family who've been devastated by ice. And continuing consumption of ganja means that they eventually get psychological illness as well. So by taking our people out bush was to get them away from those sort of temptations and teach them a little bit about resilience and being able to work alone. So Yalmangor, this is that Pindam Kondong I was talking about. That's me there, the Mimosopsilingi. Terminalia cunninghamii is another amazing fruit that some research has been done on, and the gumbacha, which is the plum from desert side, has got higher values than the ordinary walnut. So the walnuts we buy from the grocery, it far outshines that. So that's why at the moment I think there's a big interest in bush foods, because bush foods has got the natural vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, all the stuff that's good for your health is contained in the bush foods. And so we have to change people's perception of what bush foods, the value of bush foods, but at the same time making sure that Indigenous people are leading the industry and not just harvesters. So these are just some of the products that I use. At the top we've got what's called wongai, which is a beautiful bean when you cook them, taste like garlic wattles. And then rummage in there again, gubbing. And these are some of the foods that our people have been using for generations, of course. So I think baobab is going to be the next product that's going to be very, very important. So, you know, all the Yiriman ladies who are involved in the bush collecting of baobabs, that's going to grow. You know, in America, the collection of, they use baobab in every kind of health product, and their industry is millions and millions of dollars, probably trillions, I'd say. And our baobab in Australia is not yet really fully appreciated. So the families in Yigana country, Bunabao, you know, Walmijari, Guniandi, all those places that have got gubbin, that have got baobab there, that is your future in terms of economic enterprises for your families. So in the past, I've done lots and lots of research and development around, okay, how can I use these products? I've done jams and sauces, relish, I've had chutneys and chili sauces, I've done cordials. We even trialled a wine with an organic wine grower down south, and it was beautiful. But the trouble up here, I was trying to set up a wine business, and guess what happened? They stopped alcohol licenses being created just because Pat Torres wanted to do alcohol. So that went by the side, but it's still something that our families can get involved in. So we can have something like the mango farm, the mango wine industry that used to happen here, you know, with their wines and stuff. So it's still something that we can still do, but it's got to be done with proper licensing. I had to go and do a manager in food and alcohol services. I had to go and do the responsible service of alcohol. So I went through all the things I had to do. But when it came to actually creating the business up here, I couldn't get a building and I couldn't get a permit because they were cancelling all the alcohol licenses in Broome at that stage, so I missed out. And I don't have a problem about alcohol as long as it's, you know, responsible, and you can't stop people from doing something if you don't give them a chance to learn how to do it right, you know. So food and wine goes together, and food and alcohol goes together. We did a little trial with the Matso's brewery here. We gave them a free bunch, $300 worth of gubbin. They created a beer. It was lovely, but they didn't give us anything back. Another good example. And that's because the managers were changing. At that stage, it was managers changing and changing. So there was no one you could really talk to, you know, because I'm having a laugh over here. It's laughing, and it's a laughing matter, but very sad. It just shows how forever we're seeing all these barriers. So that's me. I could tell you more stories. You actually have to stop me from talking because I've learned how to talk. And any questions? You must be all getting tired, eh?
Questions, people? Thank you, Pat. Oh,
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming and sharing your voice, and it's valued, and yeah, grateful to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, look, we've had, sorry, there's one question. Yep.
Pat, you've obviously had some very interesting partnerships, some of which seem to have gone a bit pear-shaped. Would you be able to give us some tips on what you do? Or if someone was asking you that we're going to go, a young Indigenous woman, for example, was going to create a partnership with a brewery, what would they do differently, for example?
Well, I think, you know, I was learning in those days too. I would have given them a tax invoice. I was trusting that they were going to just offer to pay. So I was a bit naive there. Nowadays, I don't give anything without getting payment up front. So, and with the partnerships, I first learn who they are and see what they are like as a person. So I'm judging them on how they treat me. If I'm badly treated, I just back away and go somewhere else because I think you've got to have good relationships. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's got to be a two-way thing, and I'm happy to pay people to help me. I don't expect free from them, but it's been amazing how many times I've been asked to do things for free. You know?
Thanks for that, Pat. Look, we've had a fantastic, diverse group of presenters, and they've all done, there's a lot of food for thought, excuse the pun. Can we put our hands together just to thank all of our speakers, presenters? Thank you very much, Pat. It's good to get an insight into how you need to get accreditation and all of the stuff that Daniel's given us, and then hearing about the Yiriman women, and then hearing from Pat about what's worked and what's not worked. I could tell you some stories about the tourism industry where we get used as well, but that's for another time. But yeah, similar thing, someone wanted to give me free vacuum cleaner when they used to go knocking on doors, and sell all these encyclopedias and stuff. Then they go, tell me some story, give me some information about these certain plans, and I'm going, oh, come back tomorrow and I'll tell you. Then you tell them, sorry, I can't do that. Oh, bugger you, and they walk away from us. It's like, okay, it's not my loss. But you learn after a while, after you've been, sort of burnt a couple of times. But yeah, but we learn from it, don't we? Now, we had a couple of questions before we close, and maybe I'll hand over to Aisha to coordinate this one. So I hope you guys have had a chance to think about these 3 questions and maybe give us a bit of feedback on it.
Sorry. So I think we're ran out of time. But so yeah, don't want to hold everyone for a long discussion or anything like that. Maybe what we can do is we've got everyone's contact details. What I can do is actually just create like a really short 3-question, 4-question survey. Share it around. Because, there's two overall things. One is trying to understand for their project whether certification, the engagement certification, is a way forward and what that might look like. And then 2, who wants to get involved, who wants to participate. So I think that's the main thing, is that maybe we'll just do that, send around a short survey and get everyone's feedback on it, and any questions, and share other resources.
Yeah, unless there's anything else anyone wants to mention or say, I'll wrap up and say thank you to everyone for attending, and again, thank you so much to Maria for facilitating for us, and our wonderful speakers for sharing their knowledge and their journeys. And yes, we'll send out a survey and based on everyone's feedback, see what might come next. And yes, I can provide any resources or contacts to you. Let me know. Thank you.